Huge drops of heavy cold rain were not stopped dripping on a man who lay on the street and was unable to get to his feet on his own. He was wounded in the very heart, but not figuratively, but in the literal sense of the word, and did this man whom he completely trusted recently. And this time, he could no longer do absolutely nothing. The last forces left the man, but he tried to stay with his last strength so as not to say goodbye to life in front of the girl. She in turn stared closely into the eyes of a young man, and absolutely nothing was read in her gaze other than open hatred and mental pain. Without the slightest doubt and the twinge of conscience, she took out the sword and stuck it into the man's body. His hand did not even flinch for a moment, and for all this, the girl did not utter a word. With all his strength, the man tried to get down to at least a little bit to take the girl's hand, but he did not work out as she took a step back. She was, and at that moment beautiful, as always, precisely because he had the slightest opportunity to move into her body. Without uttering any word, the girl stepped back a few more steps, and for the last time cast a man with an impenetrable gaze, then turned around and disappeared. Kim Uden exhaled noisily. Pressing the last keys on the keyboard, he finally completed this level, and the game developed by the best specialists was saved. But the young man was used to doing everything impeccably, so he decided to check everything again in order not to miss the slightest mistake, because a lot depends on this. He spent too much time on this work, but he managed to get rid of the bug in the plot, and in the main character he put his whole soul and broke his engagement. His name was Kim Uchin, and he worked in the largest company of gaming software in the country called REW. The guy held the position of designer models of characters / Today, he was already fed up with work. The guy wanted to walk a bit and unwind after the whole day spent by the monitor of his working computer. He held a good position in REW, which has gained worldwide fame, and always did its work 100%. This time was no exception. Right now, Eugene has tested a new entertaining game into which the company decided to pour all its money, counting on a stunning success. In other words, if this masterpiece in the near future will not shoot and does not become mega popular, then their company and his career will also come an obvious end. The key feature of the game was a dynamic change in complexity and plot, which directly depends on the choice of the right player who have already deserved maximum attention from advanced gamers. In addition, in the game there are many classes: a magician, knight, researcher, demon, demon hunter, aristocrat, king, and this is far from a complete list. Thanks to the variety of roles, the player can become anyone in this world. In other words, if the game shoots, then the company's employees will become very rich people. But if it fails, then the employees will be left without work. So Eugene has once again checked the settings of the main character so as not to miss anything. The reason for his processing, a few months later, was one guy, the main character of the game, Declane von Gran, whom Eugene finally cleared of bugs. In the middle of the game, where Declane became the boss and the head of the professors, as well as one of the changed characters, it is becoming increasingly difficult to manage the plot. Due to many different interchanges with the participation of this character, Eugen had to correct a huge number of mistakes and finally kill him so that everything goes as it should. And the reason for his sudden death in this episode was the blow of his bride with a sword right in the heart, the real vile betrayal of the closest person. But according to Eugene, such a plot turn was quite predictable, given the relationship of the heroes in the game. The guy was so carried away by his occupation that he did not even notice that someone quietly entered his office and had been watching his work for several minutes. Behind him stood a young girl of a very pleasant appearance. On her face was an expression of deep interest in the process that Eugene was engaged in. A girl named Inu Ara was the head of their development team in the company and was a real professional in her field. And she was the former lover of Eugene. They met for a long 7 years, and their relationship could be called ideal if you look from the parties. They understood each other at a glance, but no one could understand how they managed to get along together, because Eugene was absolutely lazy, and Ara was a real workaholic. The ambitions of this girl helped him become the best version of himself, believe in his own strength and achieve the results, because he took an example from Ara. But over time, their views on life began to differ sharply, and soon the couple broke up, and as it turned out later, Eugene failed to change completely. Now Inu Ara has entered the office of the ex-boyfriend, because she heard from employees that there were some problems with the development and design of the characters in the game. Eugene heard in the smoking room from his colleagues that he had found a new guy for herself, and, judging by the rumors, everything was very wonderful with them. The guy decided to directly ask if the ex-girlfriend in her personal life is good. She smiled and said she felt happy in a new relationship. It was not particularly pleasant to hear such information, but Eugene continued to smile, said that he hopes that young people would get married and they will be fine in the future. Ara actually came not to talk about her personal life, but to report that in the game you need to change some nuances. The ending of the story has once again changed a little. The guy once again asked if his boss was sure that this character should only be an intermediate boss, because he looks just stunning, and losing such a hero is just stupid. It turned out that further the game would directly depend on the charm of the protagonist of Declain. The further the story comes in, the stronger the hero himself becomes. In Uara, as if by chance, Gina told that the image of the main character of the game was taken precisely from Eugene. Especially they are similar in the appearance and manner of behavior. The girl was even laughed at the fact that Eugene did not notice to this day that he looked like a hero, like 2 drops of water. He replied that he saw the artist only twice. Ara joked that when she meets the protagonist in the game, she immediately tries to end him, but apparently Eugene did not really like such a joke. After the chatter, a serious conversation began. Ara asked if the guy liked everything in the game, but he said that he did not like the fact that the fate of the company depends only on this development. Ara replied that in her opinion, everything would be fine with the game. The game trailer simply blew up the internet, and Eugene just exhaled in her words. Time and effort were spent not in vain. The guy decided to knead his legs and went to the window. A steep wheelbarrow was below the office, and he asked if it was a new friend in Uara. Indeed, near the car there was a young man in a business suit, and judging by time it was clear that he had been waiting for his lover for a long time. But on the face of a young man there was no noticeable anger or irritation. He rested at the car door and read something on the phone. Eugene, as if by chance, told Ara that she would not force her new guy to wait for her for so long. It would be time to determine her attention to her admirer. The girl was scared, looked at her watch and nodded her head. Indeed, something she earned, and got sick with Eugene. It's time to leave. Eugene politely said goodbye to his boss, and once closed the door behind him, exhaled heavily. Probably he still had a drop of feelings for this girl. I did not want to go home at all, because no one was waiting for him there, so Eugene decided to once again check all the characteristics of the main character of Declain. It turned out that the character's artist was indeed a professional and by order of Ara, developed the image of the protagonist, who really looked very much like Eugene. As thought and scenario in childhood, the Declain was called a genius and erected to the pedestal. However, he did not differ in his characteristics from other magicians. But because of his arrogance and birth in a famous aristocratic family, his character became simply terrible. Sometimes Eugene himself did not consider this hero a man. But the point was that this hero was already long surrounded by those who fiercely hated him, and this became the main problem of the plot. Eugene thought for some time that the hero needed to add some other attribute or some bright character trait, but so that it was noticeable to everyone. Since they are all inspired by the image of Eugene, it would be quite logical to add an attribute of understanding. It will be something like empathy. Finally, at least the hero will be embodied by those features that Eugene himself clearly lacked. So the guy endowed Declana with wealth, mind, understanding, and heightened feelings. The guy even became a little ashamed due to the fact that his hero turned out to be almost perfect, with the presence of all those qualities that the developer himself lacked. Therefore, until new serious problems arose, Eugene decided to return everything to his place. Eugene heard a characteristic sound that reported that he had received a letter to him, but who could write him at such a later time? It turned out that this was a screenwriter. To the guy's great surprise, the screenwriter did not ask him to send him the final version of the development of the game, but wrote that Eugene just looked out the window. It was more than strange, but the guy nevertheless turned in his office chair and looked out the window. Except for the thunderstorm, there was nothing strange there. But having looked better at this very sky, Eugene realized that it was more than strange. The guy even opened his mouth in surprise. A terrible huge funnel formed between the terrible black clouds, and some strange fire shone through it. It seemed that a huge hole formed in the sky, and then a terrible monster leaked through this hole into their world. Then everything was covered with darkness for a few minutes, and Eugene felt that he was taking him to some parallel reality. He was no longer in his office. Terrible monsters looked at him. A male voice gave advice that the Declain needs to be taken care of constantly, because this hero cannot be called humble. You need to constantly be alert. Maybe at this stage it is not quite decisive, but everything can be expected from it at any time. To keep everyone around in fear, he simply understands his talents, and does it so masterly that it often causes total trust. But in fact, this person is the main manipulator of the game and the main villain of this whole story, so do not admire him. When he opened his eyes, he could not immediately understand what was happening at all, and where he was. Someone shouted to him that it was time to get up for a long time. A girl stood over his bed, and judging by her face, she was very angry. Behind her stood a frightened maid and asked to calm down. It finally dawned on Eugene that he simply got into the body of his hero and is now sitting locked up, and for a long time was suffering from his beloved woman. It seems that the young girl was on the verge of a breakdown. She threw the papers on the table and said that if Declain wants to maintain the status of a professor, then it would be time to recover. After that strange hole in the sky that he saw from the office, he in some wonderful way was in this house. Since then, a whole week has passed. It seems that Eugene actually ended up in the world of the game. which he himself created. He was convinced by the view that he had now seen from the window. There was nothing to do. I had to get out of bed and understand the situation. Since it is already inside the game, you need to start acting, because Eugene knew the exact ending. He is a character who is destined to die every time the plot will change. That is, he cannot avoid death in any of the layouts of this damn game. And what should he do now? Because he became the main villain in the game, which he himself was developing. But Eugene understood that this would not help him to survive here. For a whole week, Eugene is a decline, the main character of the game, and is in a huge family mansion of the famous genus Euclane. At first, the guy thought that this was some kind of stupid joke, or because of overwork, his brain began to fail, and these are just hallucinations against the background of physical exhaustion. But a few days later, the sensations became so bright and realistic that I had to accept the bitter truth and come to terms with their fate. But still, the idea that, maybe life, he still suffered from a lightning strike on that ill-fated evening, and now he is simply in a coma and doctors are fighting for his life. This thought was the last straw, until he woke up in the Declan bed, and some angry girl, probably a close relative, had to stand up on him, had to get up and quickly put herself in order. With any choice of a player, he remains an intermediate boss, a source of all troubles, and a threat to absolutely everyone, the cause of the pain of many characters. Another serious problem was that Eugene had no idea at what stage of the game he was now. The only thing he realized that he owed a certain amount of mana. The game was checked by absolutely everything in the company, but according to some strange rackets of circumstances, it was Eugene who fell directly into the game and became its main character. This hero survived only once. He was created only in order to die every time after he played the role of an intermediate boss. He picked up several sheets on the table. These were documents from the university where Declan worked, holding the professor's post, and was engaged in the study of mana. On the table, these papers were left by his half-sister, Ariel von Euclane, who was currently considered the head of the clan Euclane instead of Declan, and was with a guy in extremely stretched relationships. And the young woman, whom Ariel recalled during the morning tense conversation, was Julia, the bride of Mr. Declan. He recalled that his sister threw the papers on the table, and then shouted that he had to start acting if he did not want to lose his professorship. And only now the guy began to reach the guy that in the plot of the Declan, he is indeed a university professor, and he soon begins another lecture with students. Something began to be truly strange. He needs to get used to his role as soon as possible, and try to make sure that he is alive as long as possible. But to do this is not so simple, because he had never given lectures before. He has no idea what to tell students and how to behave in front of a crowded audience. All that Eugene remembered is that in order to survive in the game, you need to become useful here, and a lecture at the university is only a side task. Since he ended up here, words have been hanging in front of his eyes, reminiscent of the importance of his actions, and even because of Ariel, he felt that he had to go to the university. Therefore, you need to quickly put yourself in order and then find information on the topic of a lecture so as not to look stupid before young people. He will not survive this. After all, he himself invented the characteristics of the character of the Declan, endowing him with the ability to understand anything, but at the same time, he would spend MANHUA. Before becoming Declan, Eugene gave him this attribute so that the hero received at least a little empathy, which was so lacking in real life himself. But since this is an attribute of a unique rank, it should appear in the game later, but most likely, some hidden effects should be present here. Oddly enough, it did not seem to Eugene that he was not at ease, and in a classic suit he was extremely comfortable, like he had dressed his whole life. Now the guy thought that it was not in vain that he devoted so much time to prescribing the character of his hero and gave him such a feature as a sense of style and good taste. It was as if someone constantly whispered in his ear that this body now belongs only to him. He cannot even be rude now, behaves exclusively, like an aristocrat. The fact that Eugene once considered the usual formality, now it did not seem at all. On the contrary, it looked natural and organic, as if it had been like that. Oddly enough, on his first lecture in his life, he went with a full parade, and with absolute calm both externally and internally, he will succeed. But as soon as he stayed in this image for several minutes, vile doubts began to creep in. He was just a designer of the characters, a little lazy and a little irresponsible. That is how Ara characterized his relationship recently. But he was tall, attractive and smart, but more often a lazy and miserable bastard. That is how Eugene had many complexes that he masterfully tried to hide behind a bad mask of confidence and indifference to the outside world. Near the front door, he was already waiting for a chic car. He used to only dream of such a thing. There was also a personal driver who did not forget to bow low at the sight of his master. Trying to seem absolutely calm, the guy greeted the driver with a light toe of his head and tried to quickly end up inside the car, avoiding prying eyes. From his balance, he was brought out by the fact that he was not alone inside the car. In the back seat, there was a very young boy. The next second, he politely greeted the man and held out his hands to Eugene, in which he held some documents. It was necessary to react at least somehow. He no longer remembered who this boy was, the assistant to the declane, or his personal secretary, but he will figure it out a little later. It is necessary to think about a lecture at least in the car. He thought that the guy took her with him to the car. For a start, at least it was worth finding out the topic of which is planned for lesson today. All the necessary information was collected on several sheets. It was just necessary to read and delve into the essence of the topic. The boy helped him a lot in this matter. Most likely, this guy held a position that involved absolutely all the work instead of the declane, so the man simply thanked. At first, the boy did not even understand that the master addresses him, because he hears such words from this person for the first time. They simply absent in his vocabulary. The driver was even distracted from the road for a moment. He was scared, because something strange happened in the car. The owner praised an ordinary person for the first time in his life. Eugene immediately realized what kind of nature the Declan really had. It was obvious, and he was just disgusting in his soul from what kind of man he was. While they were driving, he thought that even in the Euclide's mansion, everyone treated him with caution, except for the consolidated sister, of course, which was not at all afraid of him. After half an hour, they arrived at the place where Mr. Declane worked, Imperial University, the main educational institution of the country and the entire continent. Eugene slowly got out of the car and looked at the building with a careful gaze. It really delighted with his pomp. He needed to find the lecture hall. Almost all students had already gathered inside and were looking forward to meeting with the world-famous professor to hear his lecture. Everyone whispered that Declane is a master in the interpretation of spells, and in childhood he was called a child prodigy and prophesied him a great future. And this moment came. The professor seemed in the corridor, and the students simply froze, opening his mouths with admiration at the sight of such a famous person. Declane, without losing his natural grace and calm, entered the audience, introduced himself as a professor of the Magic Tower, and easily nodded to the students in greeting. Then he went through the department with a confident step, and once again looked around the lecture hall, and then said that he was ready to start a lecture. Behind the desks, there was an easy noise and whispering. Young students immediately began to discuss the delightful appearance of the arrived professor. But one of the girls strongly strained and did not take a sharp gaze from the professor. She was not delighted with the meeting and almost tore her abstract from anger. She did not expect this meeting, or rather, really did not want to meet this terrible and vile man, because Professor Declane was a sworn enemy of her father. She considered this person the most vile and inhuman all over the world, and all that she wanted was to avenge her father, show him that punishment is inevitable. This happened 3 years ago. It was her that then her father decided to commit suicide, and she already thought that she could not survive this tragedy. For many years, a man was studying the recognition of spells, but after someone appropriated the thesis and sentenced him for his own, he was deeply shocked and fell into despair as a result, deciding to pass away. That man who appropriated all the achievements of Julia's father was Professor Declane. It was he who stole the work of her father's whole life. But Julia could not do anything at that moment, because after the death of her father, the girl lost absolutely everything. She was left alone in the whole world. Julia, born of an aristocrat, lost absolutely all the benefits, her high position in society, including the family house and all the lands belonging to her father. Therefore, the girl promised herself and the parent that she would definitely take revenge on this vile person so that she should not be worth it. After this oath, the girl is not without problems, but nevertheless entered the Imperial Nobility University, where her sworn enemy Declane taught. Let the other students did not know, but she was aware that his ability to recognize spells are the results of her father's works. How he could lift his nose like that. The professor should have belonged to her father, and she will certainly expose the deck of the Declane and disgrace the entire continent. But now the girls need to pull themselves together and restrain themselves to overthrow the Declane from the pedestal. First, you need to prepare very well for perfect revenge. The noise of the students distracted Professor Declane, so he turned again to the audience and asked for silence, because the lecture had already begun. The man once again introduced himself as the main professor of this magic tower, not forgetting to clarify that he is a monarch of magic, which can control absolutely all the elements. The professors told students that all the magic is divided into 3 large attributes and 9 small types. Attributes are sources of magic, its beginning. Type of magic include calls, spirits, destruction, support, disappointment, manipulation, plasticity, and bewilderment, as well as harmony. To himself, the man thought that it turns out with the attributes of the magician to give any lecture very simple, he owns absolutely all the information. This was the first lecture in the life of Eugene. From the theory of magic, he was not familiar at all, but even just reading a piece of paper, he perfectly understood what he read. And the guy not only noticed this, it turned out that the vast majority of the grace forced all those present to focus, and the atmosphere seemed natural and not overwhelming. Eugene thought for a minute that maybe the declane had the features of a good teacher and speaker. He easily told students about the use of mana. Usually, magicians keep their mana in their heads, where it is easiest to imagine spells. Knights store mana in the heart and spread it throughout the body with the help of blood flow. And there is still an inner core where external and internal mana can be mixed. This is the most universal place for storing magical abilities. What the professor wanted to explain was quite simple. Hard work is important, but without talent, it is better to focus on something one and develop in this direction. According to Eugene, the declane's talent did not particularly delight. His current supply of mana was small, but in some personalized magicians, this stock was 10 times higher. The guy had a thought that this is an undertaking with a game of a professor can be a failure. He does not have enough magical skills, and self-confidence is lame. It was ironic that Eugene during the lecture spoke of those things that he himself should pay attention to in real life. He finally finished the lecture and thought that the real declane would hardly have coped with the task, but he succeeded without any problems. The professor asked the students if they had no questions about the lecture. There was silence in response, and the guy breathed a sigh of relief. The girl jumped up and said in an evil voice that last night, strange spells were discovered in their hostel. Presumably it was the work of the devil. What the professor would say to this? Declane examined the girl from head to toe and asked if she was from a university magic tower, because Tanya was completely like a student. The girl was confused. She did not expect such a direct question. Therefore, on the go, it was necessary to come up with some cunning answer. Declane explained that in this case, for her, it should be natural first ask permission to ask a question, then introduce himself, and only after that start asking everything that interests her. He was not going to answer the child's question, even close to the rules of etiquette, and in this case, the girl did not find what to say. The guy realized that now, activating his ability to understand, he spends too much mana, so it was necessary to finish this stupid conversation. The girl remained standing in the middle of the audience. The rest of the students now and then turned to her and were already starting to make fun because she was nobly disgraced. From the outside it looked like this. She wanted to stand out and attract the attention of the professor, but everything came out quite lousy. When the declane was already at the door, the girl shouted to him that he, as a university professor, determined the type of magic used. She decided to insist on her own, and this pompous scientist should immediately identify these spells to students. She said that right now, several debutantes in the hostel are analyzing this spell, but nothing comes out for them. Everyone is waiting for the professor's help. Declane could not fall his face into the mud, so he stopped, and in a calm tone said that this was a barrier of a bending type. It seems someone wanted to drive the girl into a trap. And again, the girl looked from the side like a real self, confident stupid. Not so she planned to finish the conversation with the professor, but he had already closed the door behind him. After the lecture, most students immediately went to the local cafeteria. Located on the territory of the University Magic Tower, there was something to discuss. The girl even lost her appetite. She wanted to expose the professor and prove that his skills for recognizing magic are only fiction. But instead, he notably exposed her with an uncultured idiot because she did not even have time to say her name because she thought that she would die with shame. She was pleased with the fact that at least he was at least for a moment, and this meant that he still did not have enough confidence. She simply brought unknown spell, which someone painted on the dormitory door last night. At first the last chaos reigned, but then it turned out that this increased the research skills among beginners. Suddenly a classmate ran up to her and said that after a instinct of the spell on the door, according to the assumption of his barrier nature, it turned out that it was exactly so. And also a friend called Emu a real hero, because none of the students had any no longer dared to ask this terrible professor about the spell. The girl's eyes climbed onto her forehead. The declane really could solve everything. There were no parameters where he knew that it was a fool. The classmate quickly said goodbye, once again calling the girl a hero, and ran to the library to add her abstract, leaving the off shock. The mood of the offspring fell again. Only think, the declane managed to guess the type of spell. She just took and improved the reputation of the professor. The girl decided to get acquainted with the list of lectures that Professor Declane will read in their group in this semester. You need to know his enemy in order to win in the battles in the future. From now on, she should not hesitate if she is going to interact with this annoying professor in the future, and she will interact, that's for sure. She must be baked with this person, and for this you need to learn more information about him. It is easier to build a plan of revenge. A little time will pass, and with its help, everyone will find out that Professor Declay is not a famous scientist. He is just a charlatan and a deceiver who appropriated other people's achievements. The professor could have come awry. When he looked at the girl's spell, his understanding was spontaneously activated. Only one look at this circle completely exhausted his supply of mana. He was so excited and discouraged that he could not even understand that this was actually a spell, not to mention his principle of work. But at least nothing bad or catastrophic happened until he met an old familiar in the university's courtyard. This could not be. A girl with white hair and bright, beautiful eyes. He saw her on the screen of his monitor 1,000 times, and now she stands right in front of him. And now Eugene openly did not understand how to behave. He poorly remembered this storyline. Therefore, the guy remained cold. Julia Ferdine, on the contrary, was in a good mood. She sincerely smiled, greeted the guy, and asked how to do that. This girl, Julia, was the bride of Declain, as well as one of the personalized characters, and in the script she was destined to become the top of the local chivalry, and Eugene did not expect to see her here at all. Seeing that the guy does not react to her in any way, the girl was angry with how he could feel normal after he broke their promise a week ago. Declain continued to frankly stupid. He had no idea what kind of promise the girl was hinting at him. He clearly missed something from the plot. In order not to look stupid, the guy referred to the fact that he was in a hurry, to which the girl shouted that he was just trying to escape in the past. I had to frankly lie that he suffered a terrible fever that erased all the latest events from his memory, and he really does not remember what was discussed. Somewhere on the subcortex of consciousness, a picture surfaced, where Julia asked him to admit his pretense and arrogance, and in return, she promised to stay with Declain. It is now a girl who understood that she was in vain for this man, and his words, like all promises, mean absolutely nothing. He is just a liar. She trusted him in vain. It was understandable already that recent evening, so Julia decided that she was releasing Declana. And he probably was not very opposed, because he said nothing in response. He didn't even look for his excuses, or maybe he simply did not want to. Now he remembered clearly the moment when he simply turned around and left, throwing Julia alone in the middle of an empty street. Her engagement with the famous Professor Declay was dictated exclusively by mercantile targets. This was understood in aristocratic circles. He was a talented professor of magic, a famous person in aristocratic circles, and Julia was considered the best knight in the country. The union turned out to be good. Everyone said that their marriage should bring an inconceivable benefit by both birth, so none of the parties was against the wedding. Immediately agreed on the engagement, which was exclusively attended by family members, because the newlyweds did not really want to attract unnecessary attention. Let Julia and did not like Declain. She generally knew little about him, but she could not go against the decision of a kind. But once both kinds realized that Declain never had talent, the professor of the Magic Tower did not present a single new study over the past 3 years and generally ceased to achieve success. Despite all the rumors and articles in the press, the Euclanes and Freudens tried to hide the real truth and depict it in full harmony and understanding with all their might. I was sure that everyone pretended only because not one of the clans did not want to cause vile rumors. Their mistake should not be known to the public. But the girl could not forgive the professor. She could not tolerate outright lies. It was her knightly beliefs that she never cheated. Therefore, Julia made a promise from the professor that he finally publicly confesses that he did not own magical abilities. He simply did not have them, but he could not keep their promises. The Imperial Magic University was considered the best educational institution of the country, and the Magic Tower was also a real example of architectural art. Eugene himself developed the style of the building, relying on the building of Seoul National University, and came out with the guy, in his opinion, pretty well. Everyone liked it. Around the building itself was the huge territory of the park for students to relax. It was well groomed, and young people were happy to have changed and free time from studying. The developer team spent more than one sleepless night in the office, so that in the game, everything looked just like an atmosphere of modern higher educational institutions. Walking around the university, Eugene thought it would be much better if he was here in a completely different body, or was not at all. Suddenly, he was abruptly pushed, and Eugene realized that someone crashed at him at full speed from behind. Indeed, it was a young guy with a box full of books that was traveling with him in the car. The boy fell and it seems was very bored, but immediately began to ask for petitions from the stranger, justified that he was in a hurry to meet with his professor. Eugene vaguely remembered this plot, so the guy did not really manage to recall. He did not even know what his name was, so he did not dare to speak the first. But the guy, fortunately, decided to introduce himself to himself. His name was Alan, and he was to blame, because he fled, did not look at his feet. Besides, there was a huge paper box in his hands. Together, they entered the professor's office, and Alan said that he brought Declana a list of sponsors for new magicians this year. That's why he was in a hurry to make the master as soon as possible. Magic towers were very similar to the modern research centers of the real world. In other words, money was always needed for new research. The professorship of the Magic Tower has always sponsored young beginner magicians, whom he considered worthy and in which the potential for work. One of the letters was definitely from a very rich and influential person, and judging by the document, this tycoon could sacrifice a considerable amount of their university. Declain began to carefully study the prints on letters, learning in them very rich and influential families, and such letters, to great happiness, were enough. But the last document on sponsorship interested the young man especially, because this name was very familiar to him. The whole department worked over the character of Ephraim Luna, According to the developers who were responsible for this hero, the Moon was not a simple player, but one of the main personalized characters, and she lost her father precisely because of the meanness of the Declane. But the assistant grimaced and began to quietly explain that this girl was denied sponsorship. No one wanted to deal with her, or was too afraid of Ephraim's character. Or maybe the sponsors were afraid of the reactions of Professor Declane when he found out that someone decided to invest in this abnormal and very claims girl. The girl was really very smart, so she could easily get directly into the Magic Tower, bypassing the Imperial University, but she was a direct enemy of Declane. And if he enables events to develop as the REW scriptwriters came up with, he will soon meet his destruction here, because many wish his death. According to the scenario, he can die countless times, for example, from a terrible poison that he will be heated into a glass of wine during some kind of dinner. Also, in one of the options, a bomb will explode right in his office, which his sworn enemies will be carried there. That is, he can die at any time. Whatever the method is used, all of them led to death, so Declane now decided to act differently, not as it was planned by the developers of the game. And now he had a complicated choice in front of him. A real professor of Declay would never have made such a decision in his life, but he was just Eugene from the development department. Therefore, the professor wrote something in the document and handed the sheet to Alan so that he would have issued him properly, and so that the guy brought him the books that he ordered in the library. He decided to invest in a young magician who will subsequently bring huge profit with his activities because in order to survive, he will need a lot of money. But this was not enough because the world has a huge number of personalized characters who simply dream of killing him as soon as they have such an opportunity. Declane perfectly understood that the best way to survive further unpleasant events regarding his life is of course to become stronger. However, he also understood that his talents are rather mediocre. At such a pace he could not cope with the upcoming future threats if he was not sufficiently prepared. He will not be able to survive the countless deaths awaiting him if he does not think through the clear plan of his subsequent actions, or maybe even several options for such a plan, just in case. However, the Declane still had one advantage, and this advantage was his attributes. He perfectly understood their real value. Declay, despite all his boasting, was unable to control all four elements, but he definitely had the potential in manipulating fire and earth. The combination of earth, fire, and metal gave him a unique attribute, known among magicians called Touch of Midas. This attribute absorbed the owner's mother in order to strengthen the target potential. Thus, the Declane talent was to manipulate metal, that is, levitizing blades. Management of levitating blades, this of course sounded pathetic, but in fact it was an ordinary telekinesis, although it was a rare occurrence in this world. The lack of the strength of the declarations of the moss compensate for the change in the properties of the metal. But in order to realize all this, you first need to study the manipulation of objects. And the guy decided not to put everything in a long box, but to try to manipulate objects right now. It's time to finally check his magical abilities. The theory and spells of the foundations of telekinesis began to overwhelm his thoughts, and, to the greatest surprise of the guy, he managed to manipulate objects the first time. Now that he was able to master and remembered the basic skills of telekinesis, he needed to come up with a spell for him. That is, you see on the live what he had seen only in the game. The beginning was laid, but Declane understood that these were just the first steps. Even with high-ranking telekinesis, he could not quickly reach the desired level. This slightly upset the guy, but so far he could not change anything. He would have to be content with a set of basic skills, but this is better than nothing. Suddenly he had an idea, and what if you take and cover the whole body with magic circles? The larger the circles, the more powerful their magical potential. In this case, having known entirely his physical body, not only its brain, but also the heart, as well as the internal core will be able to enhance their telekinesis. Such an opportunity in this world was exclusively with him. The current level of mana had about 800, and this was more than enough for a simple sample. And he decided that there is simply no point in delaying this process further. It is necessary to test the action of all his magical abilities right now, and then everything will become clear. Suddenly he was pierced by a terrible pain. It seemed that hundreds of burning needles were digging into the body, as if he had broken all the bones, and the muscles had taken and simply torn and thrown away. However, he decided that in any layout he would endure to the end, and will not live. He will not make a sound, because this requires his dignity of the aristocrat. It all ended suddenly. As it began, the pain sharply left the body, and Declane remained standing in the middle of his office in absolute silence. It turned out that he was not enough mana. The first time nothing good happened, he was terribly tired and barely stood on his feet, but he still reached something. Now there was a magic circle on his shoulder. He calculated that at such a pace to cover the whole body, it will take about 2 weeks. But it was not scared. Every day he will have lectures at the university, and he would overcome everything. The next day, a group of students received a task from a professor, which was recorded on a wooden plank and attached on the board of ads. Students needed to provide an analysis of the area, a full report on the natural flows that could permeate it. In this way, Dekle decided to check their abilities. An offshoot, of course, did not doubt the negligence and irresponsibility of the professor. He decided to send students to self-training with the help of a simple signs. The rest of the students were also not enthusiastic about the news, and even the assignment itself. They did not represent practical classes with the most famous professor of magic in the country. Anthus thought that the meeting with Dekle would give her the opportunity to enjoy the professor or put him in some awkward position. But the possibility did not introduce it. Instead of Dekle, she noticed a girl who seemed very familiar to her, and after a minute she remembered, this is Sylvia von Josephine Ilad. But it seems the girl did not recognize her, but maybe she simply did not notice because the next minute she turned around and went to the opposite side. This sudden meeting even more spoiled the mood of an off-conference, which already good could not be called why Sylvia ignored her. If the girl was not mistaken, then Sylvia was a representative of the great kind of Ilada, with whom I also had its long-standing scores, and he did not pay these bills yet. 10 years ago, Ilada, trembling in front of the power of his father's father and staring her potential, surrounded their house with their troops in the hope of erase him from the face of the earth. Therefore, the offspring was 100% confident that Sylvia could not help but remember her. She just pretended to be examined on the sides and did not notice. The girl was not of a timid dozen, so she decided to trace where the representative of the enemy kind was sent and quietly followed Sylvia. It seemed that her mana disappeared somewhere, for no obvious reasons, but she already sees Sylvia, which stands at the gorge and inferently uses someone else's mana for her own purposes. The off-conference began to be indignant, because it was the impudence of the highest measure, but Sylvia seemed to not even pay attention to the fact that someone was standing and she wanted something near her. This was simply unsettled the girl. She was confused and stepped a little to the side, and then loudly asked why Ilad was doing the fork that she did not notice her presence. She could not but recognize an imposition after the family of an Exodus was presented with an ultimatum and forbade her to engage in magic. Sylvia was afraid that she could steal part of her glory. But here Sylvia, not even bothering to look at the girl, answered calmly that she simply did not know who she was and why she was pursuing her. She said that she did not know an Exodus, but she knows her father very well, that impudent and vile nobleman who, as she heard, finally left this life for the joy of everyone. It seemed that an imposition at the same moment could burst with anger and despair, or would kill this red-haired impudent right at this wall, not forgetting to take his mana back. And then it began, because the offspring could not withstand such an attitude towards himself, and even more so to the memory of his father, and now all students could see a real show in front of themselves. Sylvia also showed with all her appearance that she was not intended to be a bit of a gracious with an Exodus, and could repeat everything that she had just said. And the offspring would have already grabbed her offender if she had not jumped up into a tree, but she ran up and with a sofa in her eyes asked to repeat again. She decided that right now she would not regret the droplets of her mana, if necessary. She used it all in order to truly avenge this red-haired impudent. But Sylvia seemed to only provoke the girl and thereby exacerbated the situation. Maybe she wanted a public show and attention to her person. A real fight ensued, but none of the students even thought to get there and separate two aggressive girls. Everyone monitored the outcome of this fight from the side. Finally, the offspring dodged and managed to grab Sylvia by the hair and eventually looked in the eye, and then asked to repeat her words. How she dared to open her mouth and start insulting her father, a man who did not deserve such words. Besides, he has not been alive for a long time, and this is at least ugly. The girls did not have time to finish the conversation, because something strange began to happen in the air that attracted their attention, and all the others that were on the lawn. A funnel of emptiness formed near them, namely where Mana often and Sylvia collided, and now this funnel began to absorb everything into her pool with great force, and then a terrible explosion will happen that would not leave anyone alive. The explosion really occurred, and when the offspring opened her eyes, she realized that absolute silence reigns around her. Probably she was already dead and is in a different reality. But when the girl turned her head slightly, she saw that not far from her there was Professor Dekle himself, and all the fragments from the explosion simply froze in the air and did not move. Fortunately, all the students were alive and well. They also stood with their mouths and could not even say words. The level of surprise and adrenaline simply went scoop up. At the moment when Professor Dekle began to use telekinesis skills, enthusiastic exclamations were heard around. Magi's students simply could not help but feel it. It took an offense only a few seconds to understand that Professor Dekle used the magic of enchantment, seeing which it was impossible to take his eyes. Not a single muscle trembled on the face of Dekle. A man said in an icy voice that he considers their practical lesson to be finished. All students, of course, except for those two who provoked this incident, you can freely disperse and go about their business. I did not plan such a turn of events, and did not expect at all that this vile professor would leave her and Sylvia for conversation, which would definitely be unpleasant. The three of them went into the interrogation room, where the entire commission had already gathered. The situation there was honestly disgusting, and the Declane was not enthusiastic about it. Declana was welcomed by the professor of the Department of Spiritual Research Retlin and professor of the Department of Magic Revolution. They both smiled evenly and bowed to the man. The chairman of the University Magic Tower, Adeline Sigelian, also greeted the guests and thanked that everyone managed to arrive so quickly. One of the members of the commission asked who this daredevil, who allowed himself to raise his hand to Lady Sylvia, who is a representative of the great kind of Illad. She was anyone, just ink, who could not even bring her training to the end, which is why such nameless offspring should be punished along the whole strictness of the law. But Retlin and Relin began to compete in flattery to the Professor Declane, saying that the man was in time at the place of conflict and managed to resolve him in a matter of minutes. Sylvia was the daughter of one of the most influential births of Illad, and Declane perfectly understood that now she would be justified, and an offspring, an orphan girl, would remain guilty. So the man decided that now the fate of this girl is in his hands and he can change not only her, but also the plot of the whole game, which he actually was going to do. Previously, he was able to see how scarlet energy gradually pours out from an impudent, and he was able to do this exclusively thanks to his magical vision and mana. Yes, and if he does not try to change the result of the game and the fate of the offspring now, then Professor Declane is waiting for his participation. That is, 100% death. The chairman of the meeting began his speech and immediately began to blame the offspring of the fact that she dared to attack the representative of the aristocrats, Sylvia Illada. The girl lowered her head, but out of the corner of her eyes she noticed that Professor Declane was closely watching her, so she could not say something intelligible in her defense. And the vile Sylvia also did not take her gaze from her. It seemed that she was just standing and mocking an Exodus, and rejoices that her father finally said goodbye to life. Illad insulted her father, and the imposition itself caused a lot of significant troubles and unnecessary anxiety, but she could not tell this in the presence of her worst enemy. The chairman was tired of asking questions that were left without a single answer, because the off-law was stubbornly silent and did not even try to protect herself. The old professor recalled that the girl needs to remember the significant difference between themselves and Sylvia Illad, and finally know her place in this society. The word was given by Sylvia, and, to the great surprise of the Declane and the offspring itself, the girl said that during the lesson she damaged the work of an offshore, and therefore a conflict arose. But the commission considered that Sylvia did it unintentionally, and this girl without a genus and a tribe simply could not control her anger and began to offend the young mistress. Further, high-ranking members of the meeting turned to the chairman and gave a request to expel this boor at the university. Such people definitely have no place here. The imposition felt that she was a little more, and she simply burst into tears. She was so offensive that not a single living person in this hall wants to intercede for her. Everyone began to whisper, and the offspring perfectly understood what kind of decision this unfortunate commission would make, which is doing what was repented to the aristocrats and their children. But then the unexpected happened. Professor Declane himself asked for the words, arguing that he was at the scene of the conflict and he has something to say. The professor got up, looked at those present, and stopped his gaze at Sylvia, and then asked her if she thought that in this conflict there was absolutely no guilt. None of the members of the commission did not expect such a turn of events. Everyone took it for a strange joke of Declane. Even an offense did not understand why he was doing this. Declane said that Sylvia could no doubt prevent this conflict, but did not specifically do this. Perhaps she did not have enough abilities that she is undeservedly attributed to her. Sylvia bowed her head and quietly asked for forgiveness. She deliberately did not reflect the impact of the offspring, but only because she did not get into even greater trouble because of this. The old professor could not calm down in any way and tried to prove the Declane that the fault should lie on the attacker and not on who decided to defend himself. But the eyes of the offspring expanded even more when she heard that Declane began to object to the professor who took the side of Sylvia. But why he would go so far away, the girl did not understand at all. He frankly tried to protect her in front of this cruel and vile commission, proving these people that Miss Antaray behaved absolutely normal in the situation that developed. The chairman of the meeting could not stand the first. She asked for a moment of silence, because everyone needed to gather her thoughts and make the only right decision. The woman said that young people tend to fight when they grow. These are just children who have recently become debutantes. So this time she suggests just turning her eyes to what was happening. The meeting ended at this, but the old professor did not forget to make another compliment to the deck, saying that this is his merit that not one of the girls was punished. Only the diplome only continued to stand in the middle of the meeting room and could not decide for herself what to do in this situation. She looked at the silhouette of the Declane, which was slowly moving away. It was definitely necessary to do something, so she shouted to the man that they needed to talk. He should remember the name of the moon, and in particular, the head of this surname, that is, her father. And if Dokleen knew that this person suffered all his life under his oppression before committing suicide, now he would behave completely differently. The situation was so confused that the deprivation made a big pause. She did not know what to say next. Say, Dokleen remembers everything and saves her now to reduce her guilt. But such an option is also possible that the professor of magic really does not remember the moon in the family, in particular an off-conferent and her father. Then she looks completely stupid in this situation. Therefore, the girl stood and could not decide for herself whether she should ask her man what she wants, or is it better to keep silent. The professor himself saved the situation. He turned to an off-conferent and asked him not to spend his potential on business for the long time. Then the man simply turned around and left, leaving the girl in complete silence and loneliness in the middle of the hall. She needed to be alone with her thoughts. She thought so. Dokleen really knows her and her father. Otherwise, why then to protect her? Maybe he feels responsibility. At heart, the deprivation became completely bad. It turned out that Professor Dokleen helped her solely because of pity, and this she wanted the least. And since he still remembers the offspring, he could not forget the situation with her father. She must be satisfied with this. In any case now. The car slowly moved along the forest road, and Sylvia, located in it, had the opportunity to stay alone with its thoughts. Ludwig Ilada was driving the car and was completely concentrated on the road. I am the head of the Ilad family. The man was very worried about the current state of Sylvia. She was too thoughtful. The girl really sat in the back seat of the car and was completely in her thoughts. She thought about an offshore that really had a great talent, but her train had already left. 10 years ago, on the day of the entrance exam at the Imperial Academy, for the first time in her life, she met this girl. And it was from that moment that their common story began. It was there that they met, and the professor, who took entrance exams, was extremely concerned about the situation. Both girls had huge magical potential, and they had almost the same level with them, and that and the other could become archimags without problems in the future. The applicants also did not understand why such a problematic situation related to them had developed. They looked at each other and did not yet understand that they were competitive. The top of the eternal magical world was a creature at such a level that even the emperor did not dare to touch him, who reached this level called the Archmages, and their names were carved in the history of the continent. However, according to an ancient tradition that has not changed hundreds of years, in one era, the existence of only 3 Archmages is possible. Their specialization is not important, and this was an unchanged rule. At that time, in addition to the place of Demerkin, there were 2 more free places, but one of them probably belongs to Adeline, the chairman of the Magic Tower. In other words, the girl Sylvia, the heiress of the Ilada family, and the second girl, the off Luna, whose family was a side branch, had to compete in one place. Sylvia perfectly understood this without the explanation of her father, who with all his might tried to take possession of a place at the academy for his daughter. And that day Sylvia realized that it was she who became the true reason why her native family treated her rival to the moon Luna so cruelly and vilely. All this was done only so that Sylvia, and not her competitor, became in the future Archmage on their continent. But Sylvia was a girl's girl, and understood that the competitor was so strong that she could easily take her place and trample her dream in 2 accounts. Father tried to reassure her daughter, recalling that now she should not be upset due to an offense, because her real problem is now not she, but Professor Dokleen. The head of the Ilad family knew that Professor Dokleen was not as simple as it seems at first glance. Now he was mired in difficulties. But do not forget that in childhood he was called a real child prospect. He is able to impress his genius, like an unexpected lightning strike on a cloudless day, and Sylvia guessed about this that the man managed to recognize her trap. At that moment, she easily managed to make her all MANHUA and prepared an insidious trap, which was supposed to end in contact with her mother's offspring. However, the Dokleen immediately deflected the girl and realized that the larger the incident, the deeper the wounds that the offspring will suffer. Even though I carefully checked the existence of a magical observation in that place, the professor made everyone compromise, instead of accusing it. He watched violence and made it clear that he knew everything, so it was better to follow him, and it was a threat that the girl could not ignore. Sylvia considered him an overly arrogant man, whose talents in magic only a little surpassed others, but in fact he turned out to be much stronger. Several days have passed since the meeting in the Magic Tower. One morning Professor Dokleen was in his family mansion and was going to the academy. As always, the man carefully selected his outfit, because he knew that in the educational institution, his appearance always becomes news, and all the views of the students were only chained to him. Already in the car, on the way to the academy, Dokleen was thinking that his choice to support the offspring of the moon was absolutely true and removed him himself from mortal danger. He could not even imagine that an Exodus, neglecting all the rules of caution, would be the first to decide to ask a question, maybe just because at that moment she was full of hostility to the professor. Of course, because of the past Sylvia Iled, and in particular her influential father, he can hide the grudge against him, and he will have a very insidious enemy, but the Declane had no choice but to extinguish this spark. You need to think about something else, that is, complete the following tasks. Take part in the event New Year's Flower, and get the currency of the store for this. So you need to look for personalized characters at this event. On the way to the academy, the man managed to calm down a little and gather his thoughts in a logical chain. He did not notice how the car had already stopped near the right core where the event was held. When the Declane entered the building, he immediately became the center of attention. The guests immediately bowed to him, thereby expressing the deep respect of his person. It was very noisy inside. I did not expect that so much influential people would be gathering for this event. Everyone whispered about something, discussed something, solved some issues. The man thought that this evening would become a real test for him. He did not like the place where many people gathered to discuss all nonsense. His gaze immediately stopped on a young guy named Nikelm, recognized him right away, since while still Eugene, he himself simulated this character. Immediately, the thought slipped that he had come here not even in vain. A senior man with glasses was already heading for him. His goal was to greet at the holiday of Professor Declane himself. But he was not alone. He was welcomed from all sides, shouted that they admire his activities and want their children to study with Declane. Some of those present shouted that he had long dreamed of getting to know Declane, that they had many common topics for conversation, and they are all extremely important for the academy. And after 5 minutes of presence in this hall, absolutely everything began to strain, absolutely everything. This situation openly acted on his nerves and barely restrained it. The man in glasses still did not lag behind. He proposed to arrange a joint dinner where he could introduce the professor to his family. But Declane heard someone said the name of Ganesh. He was very interested in acquaintance with the one whose name would sound in epics about adventurers. Maybe now he will be able to get to know her. The man began to look around on all sides. Acquaintance with Ganesha could become the most favorable of the events of the day, but he did not see the girl. For himself, Declane already decided that he should use this rare chance to get acquainted with such a famous person who is Ganesha. But it was not for nothing that he came to this party. Declane could not even notice that someone was watching from the balcony of the second floor intently, and this someone was the adventurer Ganesha. She was the 5th largest character at the beginning of the story. Ganesha turned out to be a young girl with a very attractive expression on her face. But most of all, she was attracted to fiery red hair, which were hidden under a cowboy hat. All this was the Declane with lateral vision. He immediately headed towards the adventurer, hoping to meet her, but the young Yelm blocked the way for him, who apparently also dreamed of talking with the professor. Nielm von Carrion Revend was the imperial magician monarch of the 4th rank, and it was clear that the guy did not miss your status at every opportunity. The young man pulled a smile on himself and already spread his hands to greet the professor, telling that it is a great honor for him to see the professor. The guy began to ask how successes in research were being progressed, and also hinted at the fact that strange rumors go about the division in the city. It was the news that Declana's research has not advanced not one step over the past 3 years, and now some doubt his talent and giftedness, and if the professor needs help, then he is always ready. Once they were close friends, but after Declane took up the post of chief professor instead of a Yelm, he hid insults and burned with poisonous envy. Perhaps once his words would hurt his words, but now the games of the words of the Nishleim turned out to be a man with an empty trill. This did not change the essence at all. Nielm hinted that if he continues to sit on the throne of arrogance, then in the near future he would lose all the support of the aristocratic society. But Declane was now thinking that because of this boor, he missed Ganesha. Therefore the professor asked his interlocutor to cover his mouth and get somewhere away, otherwise he did not answer either his words or even more so for actions. More yes, Glue did not decide not to pay attention to Nishelma and try to find Ganesha in that she would not find it before he leaves the event and he misses the opportunity to meet with her. He urgently needed to go out into the air to get rid of this bad energy, so the Declane went outside to calm down a little and put his nerves in order. He still heard through the open windows as his disappearance was discussed inside. He was from Nielm, but there were still too many annoying people around him. The man headed around the corner of the balcony, and his gaze immediately rested on the girl who stood nearby, leaning on the railing. It was Ganesha, an adventurer of the highest level, so they met. The girl knew very well that the professor was looking for her throughout the building. It was a real miracle, but laziness only wanted to slip away from obsessive bloodsuckers, but it so happened that he stumbled upon a girl whom he was looking for a long time. He already wanted to lie that he was simply lost, but Ganesha said that he knew that he was looking for her to tell something. The girl asked for forgiveness for the assignment, said that she had already returned the advance and paid compensation, and Declane realized that the relationship between them was purely business. Ganesha also apologized for not being able to deliver a talented child to the professor. She just had good reasons for this. After a little silence, she said that she was very attached to this child, so only because of this reason she could not give his deck. He could not catch the essence of the girl's words, but it turned out that Declan wanted to compensate for his shortcomings, possessing a talented child. The girl was silent for a while, and then asked the professor the question, until time he was going to live like that, and he did not understand at all what was the point, and what he was doing wrong. Until the moment Eugene ended up in the body of the Declan, the professor lived calmly and took a huge amount of flattery from people who did not bring him any benefit. He led such a lifestyle that undermined his reputation and brought much more harm than good, but for some reason, the man did not pay attention to it. Also, he did not think that he caused loved ones a lot of pain, not paying attention to the fact that he was only interested in his own glory. Declan also leaned on the railing and told Ganesh that he was going to change everything, begin to live differently, and try to correct his mistakes of the past. Ganesha was surprised by such a speech. It was unexpected, because she herself failed the professor's task, and then she just took it and escaped. Now Eugene was standing and thinking, would Declan be able to attack Ganesha at that moment? Who was one of the best warriors on the continent? It seems that his hero was really close to death. He did not know that at that moment a real Declan could think, but Ganesha was a personal character who could kill her enemy, using only one hand. Her magic attributes were impenetrable leather and master of all martial arts, so her opponent simply had no chance of staying alive. While in his bed, Declan thought that, most likely, his character did not manage to send an assassin for her, since he himself took his place. In other circumstances, she could already fall in battle. Everything did not happen as the professor imagined, but his goal has so far been achieved. He met a man useful to him, and this was the first step in establishing a connection with Ganesha. There was no more point in staying at the party, and Declan informed Ganesha so that she would not be worried, because he was going to leave this unnecessary masquerade. She froze for a moment and asked if everything was in order between them. Would he send her secret assassins to her? Will there be a pressure on her activities? The girl suggested that, using his power and the power of the Uklane family, he could calmly exert on her pressure through the Adventure Guild. Declan could find several more ways to influence this girl, but this could provoke the fact that he would receive several more enemies in his collection. The fact that he could not be at all was pleased. He had already plenty of enemies of his enemies without an adventurer Ganesha. Roylee had been looking for her relative for about half an hour and found her in the farthest room of the building. She sat in complete silence at the desk. She went to the girl and asked how long she was going to sit here and look at one point. If so, then it was not worth coming here and even more. The only thing that was interested in the girl was the presence of Professor Declan at this stupid party. She does not want to see him and is afraid to accidentally meet him in the hall. Riley said that she had not seen him, like the professor left the party, but she was more interested in whether what recently they were talking about Declan in high society. Julia suddenly remembered them with the professor of the last meeting. He left, leaving the girl alone with his bitter thoughts and a heart broken with disappointment. And now she herself really did not understand why she came here and what she expects from a party where the entire Beaumont of the country is present. She did not want excess attention. When she left the long room, she really hoped that she and the professor would no longer meet, but, as luck would have it, he was just going down the stairs from the second floor. He did not notice Julia, or pretended not to notice, but the guests began to whisper that the person who bathed in glory leaves the party, and this is quite strange. Then Julia heard what she should not hear. The ladies whispered that Declan and his girlfriend were now a difficult period. Their relationship was very stretched. And since that evening, the Declan left the party before everyone else. Rumors began to expand that this happened precisely because of a huge quarrel with a girl. But the whole point is that Eugene could not know about it. He simply completed the game's task and took part in the event New Year's Flower. From the moment he took part in a public event, a whole week has already passed. Declan did not really want to show up in public and answer their stupid questions. During these days, in addition to studying various kinds of spells and the basic skills of telekinesis, he resumed physical training to increase endurance. And he almost said goodbye to life, having a little overdoing with the experiments that he conducted, of course, on himself, since he could not trust absolutely anyone. If he were an ordinary magician, his fate would be a foregone conclusion, but Declan had special abilities that he began to use in time. Under the impression of a meeting with Ganeshi and longing for new forces, he engraved the circle of fire control in order to increase his controllability and manipulation of metals. At that time, he received a huge load on the body and decided to train him even more. And the first thing he did was developed a clear daily routine and adhered to him. And the result that he received really pleased the guy. He understood that physical training was very important in his case, as well as magical abilities. But it was necessary to return to the university and engage in their direct duties of the chief professor of magic in a magic tower. The first problem was that the statement came from the tower. The sender was the professor's committee of the magic tower, and this was already decently strained. The letter reported the upcoming audit in 6 months. He will concern the professor's progress in current studies. By the indicated period, it is necessary to prepare all the necessary documents. In the game, Declan has always been a professor, and it is quite possible that the preliminary task is to be a professor, because if he loses his position, he will lose the chance to return home. Therefore, he needs to find at least something important in the laboratory of the Declan in order to confirm the commissions of his research and their positive results. Without losing a minute, the man went to an abandoned laboratory where the scientist used to work. There was a real outrage. No one appeared in the room for a long time. If Professor Declan had been there at least from time to time, then there would definitely not be such a chaos in the laboratory. Everything will need to be restored here. The professor drew attention to a pile of garbage lying in the distance. Even at first glance, she looked especially unnatural, so something was hiding there for sure. The man came closer. All this situation and the situation were extremely unpleasant to him, but to blame someone except himself was simply illogical. He approached the chest of garbage, which not only looked bad, but also published a disgusting smell. Declan thought that it was very good that he could learn the basics of telekinesis. Under the garbage, he found an old notebook. It seems someone specially hid it there, because all the research results were encrypted in it. The golden light from the open book was simply dazzling, and this meant that the studies were simply magnificent. Thanks to his skills, a man could see how ingenious this study was. Pouring the pages, Declan realized that the study was not completed. The notebook was torn, and some places are completely absent. In some places, there was not even logic. Nevertheless, the significance of this book was enough to activate the status of a rich tycoon in the game. And in the notebook of the Cane found a medallion, opening which saw a photo of a little girl who was very similar to a student of an Exodus moon. Everything became clear. It seems that the father of the moon worked as a researcher on the Declan and made attempts to hide this study from prying eyes, especially from the professor himself. The resentment which the moon's magic put to Professor Declan was quite significant. It is obvious that it was because of him that the life of the moon was so difficult. The guy even became somehow uncomfortable. Now he must definitely complete the study with the help of understanding skills, and if he can do this, he will certainly indicate the name of the imposition in the documents. The next morning at the university's student dining room, it was quite noisy. Many young people were just sitting over a cup of coffee and chatted. But a whole company sat at one of the tables, and something actively discussed. The girl got up and said that they, commoners, should hold together all the time. In this company, there was an offense. She was afraid to admit students, which used to be a very famous aristocrat. Now she just had bad times. The girl from the company drew attention to her and said that the presence of an imposition here is simply necessary. She is very important for their circle. A friend made a proposal to appoint a representative of commoners in their educational institution, since she became a victim of Sylvia. Anfini realized that the whole company thinks that it is from a simple poor family, but if they want to create their own club, then they will need the approval of the professor, and she does not think that a man. The second girl thought, indeed, Professor Declan remained the main obstacle to their goal. It was necessary to come up with something to convince the professor. Then suddenly she asked, how about Professor Relina, because this fat man is known for being good not only to aristocrats. The offspring was so hungry that she did not care what decision the guys would come to. She just sat and looked at the insanely beautiful cakes. And while the girl was all in thought about food, the guys decided that it was she who should go to the decree and convince him to allow them to organize the club. If you think about it, then a man in his pride treats all, regardless of origin. That is, he looks from top to bottom, that at the aristocrats, at commoners. And the offspring escaped severe punishment precisely thanks to the professor of the Declan. And maybe she even liked it. So the company considers this idea very advantageous. Now the girl felt absolutely disgusting. She did not want to spoil the relationship with friends, but also to turn to Professor Declan with a request also had no desire. Therefore, the girl, as a scalded one, flew out of the dining room with the words that she could not cope with such a task. For her, it is all too difficult. She began to convince her friend that she would not succeed. If it is an exodus to the professor, then their company will get a completely reverse result. Running out of the building, she almost knocked Julia, who calmly walked along the university's corridor. She was very surprised to see the girl. And then, looking around, I saw a beautiful jacket from the costume in front of me, and somewhere she had already seen him, for sure. In front of her was a Professor Declan himself, a friend from the company commoner quietly spying on the situation from behind the door, and mentally desired an offense good luck with the professor. It seemed that the Declan generally did not give a damn about all the girls who were in his way, because he only nodded his head in greeting and continued his journey. An offspring understood that now every second is the road, so she called out to the man, said that she and her friends want to organize a club, and they needed his signature as a sign of consent. The girl added that perhaps the professor would not approve such a decision, because it will be a club of real commoners who are not really loved at the university. Half an hour ago, they and friends said that other professors would not even look at their document, so all hope is exclusively at Declane. To the great surprise of the girl, the man took the document and carefully read it, and then he told the off-conference that her team would send all the details of the club to his office. And then the unimaginable happened at all. He extended the pen from his pocket and simply signed the document with his sweeping handwriting and handed it to the girl. The professor turned and calmly headed for the core, and the offspring continued to stand in the middle of the courtyard, not yet realizing that she succeeded. A girlfriend who was simply squealing with delight ran up to her. She could not believe that the off-conference was able to persuade Declane to sign permission to organize a commoner club. At the lecture, Declane sat as a mouse and listened carefully to the professor, who today talked about the study of the essence of pure elements. She had a feeling of guilt or maybe sympathy. He brought her father to suicide, even if a man was kind to her, but this feeling of deception did not leave him. If the conscience really torments him, it would be nice if he himself revealed his sins and repented in front of everyone, then she would have calmed down. Probably the parties to the deprivation looked very strange, because the desk neighbor asked if she was fine, because she was trembling and looks very unimportant. Then the neighbor asked the girl not to worry and not to worry about rumors. The students would simply catch empty and nothing more. Indeed, when the girl began to look around, she saw that everyone in the audience was looking at her with anger and contempt. In fact, an impulse became the embodiment of enmity for the nobles and famous aristocrats after the incident with Sylvia, but she was absolutely anyway to what others think about her. The professor talked about magic circles that are still used by magic. They are filled with deep meaning in each line, but there are special nuances that should be paid attention to. Only 2 lines. Any magician can change the color of the flame of the spell. It is these lines that dictate the shade of fire. The professor wanted students to learn this today. He opened an old book and looked at the records in it, which concerned the current fire. Perhaps an off-law was not so wrong in their reasoning. Initially, the lectures of Declan were something else than the very praising under the mask of an academic position. Eugen's lectures were the true art of reconstruction, in which magic simply came to life. They were filled with explanations of the elite understanding. This shocked all the debutantes present at the lecture. Even for the aristocrats of Sylvia, who lost the joy of studying under the weight of their genius, they turned out to be very useful. Professor Declane asked the students to follow his hand. In it he held the well-known magic circle of water drafted. He had a beautiful blue hue. However, if you combine the magical circle of water with a magical circle of fire, you get something just incredible. The flame will receive the ability to flow like water. All students, including Sylvia, simply opened their mouths with delight and surprise. They did not see this before and thought that it was simply impossible. The professor rose in the eyes of everyone. Many magicians of geniuses intuitively own spells. For them, the theory is most often only a formality, which cannot be said about the professor of Declan. If so far all the magic of the continent followed exclusively theories, then all the magic has turned into monotonous and boring. This is logical. To spend all the time on theoretical research meant to leave magic without proper attention. So a one-sided approach to its study is extremely ineffective. That was the paradox of magic, and the Declane tried to convey it to students to become a real elite. It is not enough to possess only intuition, but many scientists cannot explain this. For someone whose genius is now in doubt, such stubborn emphasis on the theory of magic may seem quite strange. It was confident in this. And now at the university, all the students who were at the lectures by Declane will no longer believe a strange hearing about his incompetence in the field of magic. The imposition has never been so absorbed in the lecture in this educational institution. In the hostel of the Magic Tower, it went absolutely spiritualized. She was not even embarrassed by the inscriptions on the door of her room, and the fact that she had no place here. And under the door, the girl found a strange envelope, which was clearly addressed to her. She bent over the envelope and took out a document from there. It was a certificate of sponsorship, but who dares to become her sponsor when she became the laughing stock of the entire university? At first, she thought that this was a stupid joke, and the document was fake, but on it stood the press of the Office of the Magic Administration, which means it was definitely real. The girl immediately rushed to the office, where the secretary confirmed the information that the document on sponsorship is really the original, and Professor Declay himself signed it. Further, the offspring thought that she either went crazy or it was a beautiful dream, where everything in her life develops as she dreamed of herself. She returned back to her room and began to hastily collect things. No need someone to find out that now she owns a huge amount of money to develop her abilities. The secretary of Professor Declane looked at her so strangely. Maybe she also has plans for the money that I received in offense. It became truly scary. She began to fear for her life, because she had heard so many times about the robberies and that they could take her life for money. From an excess of emotions, she even burst into tears. I wonder who this philanthropist, who appreciated her magical abilities and sent such a sum of money for her studies. Ariel simply tore and threw with anger, but she could not do anything when she returned to the Eucline mansion. She did not find her half-brother there. The butler simply said that the young gentleman went to auction in Shackensel a few hours ago, and apparently he has long been there. She remembered very well that last year this scoundrel profiled at this auction almost a whole fortune, and now the story is repeated again. He clearly conceived something. She was simply confident 100% that her brother again thought of all nonsense. And this time she simply would not forgive him, for it was already too much. Declane really arrived in the city of Jutland at the Shackensel auction. Finally, he will be able to acquire what he had been looking for so long, that is, a certain metal. It was now on wood steel, but it was only a temporary solution, but what he really needs will appear before him at today's auction. Finally, he was held at the VIP laying auction, where he bought a place for himself, but there were already VIPs. Someone was sitting next to his chair, right in the neighborhood. And when this character turned, the Declane saw that his neighbor was a girl, and this girl was his lover Julia, who seemed to be waiting for him. Julia stood up sharply and turned when she realized that someone had entered the VIP room, and Declane himself expected to see anyone here, but not his girlfriend. Julia asked if it was true that Declane sent 2 debutantes to a disciplinary meeting, but the guy was angry and asked why she was interested in such information. The girl reminded that these students only entered the path of the debutante. Did he really want to repeat the same mistakes that he made in the past? She once again asked the guy not to do stupid things. This is the last advice to him, and Declane remembered that it was precisely such words that Julia left him when she decided to break his relationship with him. The girl of the ball is strongly tuned to break any connection with the professor of Dekle, and this time already finally. Despite Julia's charming, Declane did not even imagine this girl in the role of his bride, because mortal negative energy was constantly hovering around her. Even if he admits the fact that she will become his bride, he can fall immediately on the day of their wedding, because this girl is quite unbalanced. But it was still very strange that Julia is not one of those girls who would be very interested in auction, which means she was brought here by something completely different. In the first seconds, Declane even thought that Julia came here precisely in order to offend him and tell the guy a bunch of all stupid nonsense. But the girl shouted that she would never have gone to take and go in search of her boyfriend. She is here for a different reason. She is looking for something at the auction. It would be just stupid to repeat to an adult man the same thing several times, because whoever wants to hear, he will certainly hear and draw conclusions. This time, Declane felt a completely different energy from Julia than all the times when they met before. There was no danger and negativity in this energy. For a moment, Eugene thought that he had definitely fell by a victim of Declan's emotions. He tried at all he had gone to avoid distortion of his essence, so he held on as he could. Young people could not finish because the voice of the manager sounded in the hall, who said that an auction was beginning for visitors to Shackensel. Participants in the auction began to enter the hall, and Declane all thought that his attitude towards Julia was radically changing, and he could not influence this in any way. The host of the event began the auction, and the first lot was a unique ancient vase from the distant east, made by the hands of a famous porcelain master. When a man took off the protective canvas from the vase, all those present gasped with delight. The vase was indeed a work of art. But the Declane looked at this vase differently from how the others did. He saw a strange glow, which was inherent in the Luna's notebook in the notebook, and it accurately pointed out a very influential tycoon. It began to flare up before the eyes of those present, and the guests began to call the prices for which they were ready to purchase this lot. The guest was especially active at number 777. This person each time called the amount that no one could replay. As a result, the man bought up almost the entire collection of long-standing jewelry. Of course, this person, who became the center of the event, became precisely the decree, and Julia once again became convinced that it was important for this person to be popular. The girl became unpleasant. She and the professor are too different. This person spends a fabulous amount of money in order to simply amuse his vanity. She did not understand how even in such a decent place this person could behave in this way. She made the right decision, deciding to part with him. The presenter said that the last lot would be represented to the guests. This is an ore from which excellent swords were forged for the great people of their empire. The man finally presented a unique lot called Snowstone, which personifies the magic of nature and the real fire of winter. That is what the Declane and Julia were looking for. This stone was one of the 10 most important gifts of the earth used to create a weapon that combined both heat and cold at the same time. The presenter recalled that only the legendary dragon bones can surpass the swords that were forged from this ore, and the purchase proposals were immediately rained down. Julia was confident that she would get the stone. She came here only for her, but when she heard what price the Declane offers for him, she was just stupid. Anger simply torn her from the inside what this pompous bastard was doing, because he would not use the magical abilities of this stone. He does not have so much knowledge. A whisper walked along the back. The Puddles whispered that the Declane buys this stone solely in order to give it to his girlfriend. But the guests were surprised by the fact that the man competes so violently with Julia and prevents her from acquiring this amazing stone herself. Declan was staring at the girl intently. He understood that now in front of everyone he became her direct opponent, selecting her thing that Julia, apparently, was very needed. If he bought this lot, that Julia will definitely hide a big and terrible resentment on him. But he also understood that he himself arrived here for this magic stone. It seemed that Julia would explode now. She was looking for an opportunity to get this stone for 3 years, and who knows if she had such an opportunity. Now she would have to get out of here with a stone in her hands, and at all costs, she should beat the Declan and force him to give in. But the Declan, of course, was not going to give up. Maybe not so much Declan's as the one who was now in his body, that is, Eugene. Therefore, the professor called the amount that Julia could not surpass. She did not have 42 million, which the professor voiced, and took the magic lot to himself. Not a single auction saw such a hot fight of opponents. Everyone turned their views on the professor, who bathed in the rays of glory and admiration. He did not expect any other result. The only one who did not look at the Declan was Julia, although everyone in the hall whispered that the man tried so hard for her today and will soon give the girl a stone. She remembered the day of their engagement when Professor Declan gave her the most expensive and unique decorations, promising that it would always be so. And now she understood that the day of engagement with this person was the worst day in his life. He did not change and remained a pompous idiot who loves only himself. Looking at all the wealth that the man showed her, promising a wonderful future, Julia felt only humiliation because she was not as rich as her groom. She recalled and remembered. Many times she told her fiancé that she was not interested in expensive jewelry and all this imaginary pathos designed for the public. So on that ill-fated day, Julia just got up from the table on which the jewelry was lying and said that she was tearing the engagement on her own initiative. That is, with her own hands, the girl destroyed her own engagement. But that was not everything. This step was just the beginning. She was a model of piety, but in the end it was in the arms of Declan. The aristocrat said that in return, they promised the title of Knight of the Captain in the Order of the Eucline. Prayers for such a title were not alien to the girl, and it is obvious that someone stood behind the spread of rumors who could tarnish the name of Julia. And if Declan really thinks that she can return after this, then he is a real fool. Julia will not be able to love such a person. And now again he shows the worst features of his character, because it is obvious that after the auction he will suit and give a stone to the girl. She did not understand how much more he was going to humiliate her. But meeting in the corridor after the event, he simply asked the girl forgiveness. Declan told the girl that recently he really behaved like an idiot, once again asked him to excuse, and said that he was going to leave the event. The girl remained standing in the corridor until she called out to Josephine and offered to leave the auction together. The girl was the older sister of Julia and the daughter of the Duke Freuden. Professor Declan also decided not to linger at the auction, and immediately after its end went to his mansion. He had already returned to the house in the late evening. In the car, he reflected that Julia also wanted to get this stone, and the girl must be furious from the fact that it was he who bought this lot. Nobody was sleeping at home yet. The whole servant was on his feet when the man went inside. The butler and the maids bowed low, welcoming the owner. None of the maids dared to raise her eyes and look at the young master, realized that something had happened at home. Everything turned out to be very banal. Just Madame Ariel came to the mansion, and absolutely everyone was afraid of this woman. The sister appeared a few minutes later and said that the money that he spent at the auction had to go to the development of the mines, but his brother just threw it into the wind. But Declan did not decide to calm his sister. Told her he managed to acquire something that would more than compensate for all costs. But it seems Ariel was already tired of hearing empty excuses and excuses for her brother. She no longer believed in his word. The woman was simply furious. This fool really thinks that she would clean up after him every time he creates terrible chaos. Does he really understand that they already barely make ends meet, that the workers, including it, work here with all their might in order to stay afloat, and he simply went and spent a tremendous amount of money at the auction? What kind of unscrupulous person needs to be in order to squeeze absolutely all the money that belonged to the Eucline family? The professor finally realized that it was at this moment that the function of the death of the villain was activated. And he is this very villain. It is worth considering. But it turned out that Ariel has a golden color that breaks the red radiance of its aura, and this meant that the function of a rich tycoon is also actively. Everything turned out to be quite simple. If Dockley manages to resolve this situation, then very soon you will quickly get rich in the future. But if he can't, his death will be inevitable. And this time, the man knew exactly what he needed to do. He asked his sister no longer worry about anything. Now everything would be different. But Ariel had a real attack of rage. Does he really think that she will believe his words again? There is no time to listen to the deception. You need to deal with the consequences of what her brother had done. He carried real nonsense and does not even understand what the woman had to abandon in order to once again solve the problems he created. But the fact that the girl heard after was generally leading her into a real stupor. Declane said that he would give her the powers of the head of the Yuklin family. She certainly did not expect to hear this from her stupid brother. Is there really the remnants of reason and logic in his head? Ariel once again said that he did not believe his brother, but he replied that she could swear if she doubts his words. But it was simply pointless, and why right now he decided to take such a step of goodwill and allow his fellow sister to manage the Yuklin's birth. The sister even for a moment thought that the Declane is now not herself from euphoria, or she just feels bad and therefore carries all kinds of nonsense to reassure the woman. Ariel looked at the man and said that if there is a moment when he decides to take his words back, she will deprive him of his life with her own hands. Ariel did not want to continue this meaningless conversation and left. Her family again turned out to be bankrupt, and the next trick of Declan, and it was necessary to correct everything. Declane was left alone in the middle of the room, but now he felt that the danger has passed his life. At least this time, nothing threatens. While he was thinking alone, he did not notice that someone else was present in the room, and it was the adventure of Ganesh. She carefully looked at the man and smiled. She stood in a window opening, and for a long time watched the man. She also heard the whole conversation of Declane with his half-sister Ariel. He said that he was not calling anyone, paying attention to too late for an hour, but the girl jumped off the windowsill and said that she just passed by and decided to go in. She was very surprised by the news that Professor Declane was so easy to abandon the role of the head of the Yuklin family. It does not look at him at all. Further, the girl's words plunged a man into a real shock. She said that the half-sister of the Declane had nothing to do with the Yuklin family. Another blood flows in it. Ganesha once again repeated that the half-sister of Jacqueline Ariel does not have a drop of blood of the genus Yuklin. This is a bitter truth that few people know. Eugene recalled that according to the plot, Ariel was the professor's half-sister. He immediately guessed that she was not a man's sister. However, it turns out that her veins are not a drop of blood of their kind. Why did the guy have never heard information about this fact before? Ganesha reminded the man that it was he who himself asked to shed light on his secrets and Ariel family ties, and they already discussed it. Now the man was understandable to the whole background of his combined sister, but even so, Ariel would remain in his place and will follow the plot of history. Ganesha said that the professor was surprising her more and more. She never thought that a man could say something like that, and he himself was at a loss, given that he did not know these parts of history at all. It seems that the girl had nothing more to say, so she decided to say goodbye, hinting that she would definitely save the secret of the professor. But finally, she decided to tell the Declane a strange phrase that 6 snakeheads began their game. 6 snakeheads were the pinnacle of the criminal world. Their power was known far beyond the borders of the empire and even the entire continent. Their heads were crowned with a price exceeding millions. The girl warned the professor that these 6 ghouls were eager for those relics that the professor acquired at the auction, and his house would demand protection as soon as they entered the threshold. Declane really knew that his mansion was protected only in words, otherwise, as if Ganesh managed to quietly get into his room. A conversation with a girl practically brought a man out of balance. He already forgot about the scandal with Ariel. Now he had concerns much more serious than his sister's anger. He would prefer to better abandon such knowledge, because it does not change the essence of things. Yet he is not a real Declane. His attitude to Ariel's half-sister will definitely not change. Regardless of what secrets of blood are hiding there, he decided that the woman would forever remain his sister. Late at night, adventurers gathered on the lawn in the middle of the forest. Among them there was Ganesha, who told friends about the visit to the decree. The girl told me her thoughts that the professor had changed a lot, although she did not hide the fact that she liked the man in any role. A girl named Riley, who was a relative of Julia, was very surprised to hear that Professor Declane became more humane. But Ganesha replied that in any case, they no longer need to look after the professor. He chose a different road and now does not need magic slaves. Therefore, the girl invited her team to return to their usual activity. They performed their mission perfectly, and the professor did not need any more. She did not forget to remind her friends about the fact that everything that happened and sounded here is a strict secret, so everyone should keep quiet. The whole next day, Professor Declane held at his workplace the magic tower of the University of Imperial. Denyak was still set by that. Finally, he had the opportunity to use the system store, but the man still did not have enough funds to purchase something useful. The system allows you to use the currency of the store to improve the quality of the character. More precisely, you can improve not only your character, but also any other named player. It cannot afford to hurry and wasted such a chance, because with each raising the level of price in the store doubles. Therefore, the Declane tirelessly honed the art of memorization, as well as the control of levitating blades. Plus, everything loads its body with physical exertion. All this has become part of its schedule. Nevertheless, his fighting power is still pale compared to the famous villains, so he was in dire need of improving the quality of his mother. They knocked quietly at the door. Then it opened, and Alan appeared on the threshold, an assistant to Professor Declane. He greeted and asked for permission to enter. The guy brought the newspaper said that the master needs to be more careful because she had a news for wizards who were very alarming. The article reported on the search for Lockhart, the traces of which were seen on the outskirts of the city because the male killer intensified again. In the first quarter of the game, the male killer was the main threat of players who could afford to choose a class of magicians. This meant that Lockhart began his hunt. Of course, if it were a premium magician, the murderer's threat would be deadly for him, but now he is so strong that he does not see any particular reason to fear Lockhart. He was pleased that Alan was so worried about his reputation, about the preservation of his life, so the professor promised the guy that in the near future, he would appoint him an assistant professor. Alan did not even betray the significance of the professor's words, thought he was joking, but Declane said it in all seriousness, because he finally saw the work of the guy. The professor really received a message about the need to find a good associate professor, and he decided that it was Alan that should take this place. He deserved it. The man handed the guy a bracelet, saying that the Yuklan emblem was engraved on this bracelet, and the guy should continue to work in the same spirit. In his opinion, Alan had magnificent abilities in maintaining documentation, as well as in the implementation of ordinary everyday tasks, so Dracleen could not allow him to slip away. All employees who could not bear the cruelty and bad nature of the professor had long left their posts, but Alan did not give up and continued to work. The Declane was so felt so that he allowed a young man to leave work today and even gave him a little money for lunch in a student dining room. The guy did not expect such generosity from a constantly evil and cold man. Plus, the professor gave him so much money that it would be possible to have lunch for a whole month. He finished the conversation with the assistant and went to the library of the university where the staff was engaged. He urgently needed to study the documents of the moon student. The documents found by the professor in the laboratory directly concerned the invention of pure elements, but they had too many gaps and errors that should be fixed. And it would be nice to find some makeup to manipulation objects. This will definitely facilitate the work in the future. But when the man opened the door to the office he needed, she saw the debutante Sylvia Illad there, which, in principle, should not have been in such a place. The girl came to the library and asked for a book that was in the staff department, referring to what she needed for scientific research. Professor Rowland allowed the girl to go to the department where the staff works, by explaining this by the fact that it is impossible to prevent a student from the Illad family to gain the necessary knowledge. The secretary told Sylvia that the professor does not mind that she came to the library at any convenient time and engage in the department she needed. Sylvia Illada had a kind of hobby. She loved to study literature and languages, and therefore came to the professor's reading room to satisfy her interest. The novel, which the girl found on the shelf, was written in a strange and unknown language, which was called ethanol. On this usually, fairies wrote in ancient times. The novels in this language were extremely rare. For this reason, Sylvia went to the professor's reading room, in which it should not have access. And of course, the girl could not even think that she could stumble upon Professor Declane precisely in the university library. Of course, that a man had many questions. There was not a drop of kindness in the look of Declane. He asked the girl if she wanted to get to a disciplinary meeting again. He can arrange it without problems. Sylvia replied that here she was looking for a certain document, but she does it completely legally, because she received official permission from Professor Relina. Professor Declane said that Relin apparently violated the rules of the university, and the library secretary also violated his duties, for which they will also be punished by law. Further, the man's gaze fell on the book that he was strongly held in his hands. Apparently it was a very old romance. Such specimens were stored only in the professorship department. This book was precisely written in Ethanol's language. Did Sylvia go for violation of the rules of the university because she just wanted to read the novel in an ancient language? She tried to justify herself, telling that she admires ancient languages and literature, and as a result, really wanted to get into this department of the library. The professor decided that this time he would forgive the girl, but if she once again appears in this department without proper permission, then he will certainly take disciplinary measures, so let it be careful. Sylvia remained standing in the middle of the hall. She was very offensive, because now Professor Declane simply took and disgraced her, and also threatened her with punishment. But she did not do anything bad, just wanted to understand the ancient fairies and their intentions through reading books in the language. The next day, the professor decided to conduct a practical lesson of the university and took the group to the forest nearby. Students need to feel nature. Despite the fact that young people had a great opportunity to take a walk, this time everyone was collected as much as possible and listened to teachers. Declane also noted that in their first practical lesson they are quite calm. It seemed that the students were not at all afraid of the mountains of darkness. The Mountain of Darkness was located relative to the university. It was of great importance because it was under the protection of the Magic Tower, and the forest served both the training site and a rich repository of useful resources. However, the danger of predatory animals and toxic creatures here was extremely high, which was due to which the Magic Tower had to erect protective barriers and begin patrolling. The old Professor Relin reminded the man that the responsible person for the patrol this week has not yet been chosen. It is worth appointing someone new. It's not that the Declane had a noble reason for that, but he answered the old man that he himself would take up this matter. It was necessary to show an example to the rest of what a real professor should act. It was just that the man was assigned the following side tasks that consisted in the darkness of the magic tower. Something was drawn to the end of it. That's why he received such a test. It is interesting what this should happen on the mountain that night, which will absolutely change the genre of the game. He wanted to find out as soon as possible. A few hours later, an offer sat in a cafe near the tower, but not one, but in the circle of her friends of commoners. The company enjoyed delicious sweets and spoke quietly. An off-conference could afford the food that aristocrats usually ate. One of the girls said that she had already submitted a plan for the club's development. Most likely they would approve, so their lunch can be seriously considered the first meeting of the club members. I listened little to the offshore. She recently thought only about one thing, how to spend a huge amount of money correctly so that they were enough for all training. Suddenly, very loud and terrible cries were heard on the street, and the whole company abruptly broke off and ran out of the cafe to see what was happening there. The first on the street was, of course, an offense. The girl began to look around. It was necessary to check where the scream came from. Something was wrong, and the girl felt this perfectly. She heard someone screamed plaintively for help, so she ran to this sound. I did not understand the offshore, as it turned out in the forest, because only a minute ago she was on the street near the cafe. Finally, the girl saw the source of the heartbreaking scream. In the middle of the lawn, the girl stood. Her clothes were torn, and in some places the blood spots were visible. She asked for help, and it was clear that a magical force attacked her. Turning, an Exodus saw a man's silhouette between the trees. Looking closely, she realized that Professor Declane himself was standing there. She ran to the man and began to scream at him, because for some reason he attacked a completely peaceful girl, as he dared to do so. But Declane turned him in the direction of the girl and asked to see more closely. It was not a man, but a demon in human form. An individual froze directly on the spot. Now she really saw a terrible monster, not a girl, so it was an illusion of deception. Then the man asked the student not to interfere and move as far as possible. He needs to eliminate this demonic creature so that it would not harm people. It was time to take a real hunt. The demon was furious, because of the Declane, he lost his prey this evening. Judging by the nucleus in his head, this demon specialized exclusively in the use of illusion, but due to its unshakability, the professor saw real things, not an illusion. The famous heritage of the Euclane family, known for his hunt for various kinds of demons, was now manifested in Declane itself, and he would never allow the demon to stay alive. In the next few minutes, something unimaginable was happening in front of the Offhow. The battle of two forces was terrible, but in the end, the demon was defeated by the professor. Declane realized the fact that the appearance of demons in such a proximity to the magic tower signaling the beginning of serious things, so you need to be constantly on the alert. The so-called player's game begins, and this is much worse than a duel with an ordinary demon with magic of illusion. She could not open her eyes for a very long time. Something constantly interfered with her. Maybe it was a bright sunlight entering the window. Apparently on the street it has long been morning, and maybe now the middle of the day. I did not understand at all. The consciousness was blurred. Memory to her returned in fits and stories, and finally she remembered a strange night in the forest, and a terrible demon. The maid was even frightened for the state of the mistress, because the offspring did not look in the best way. It was clear that the girl had not yet come to her senses. She remembered how a demon appeared on the mountain of darkness last night, and an offspring fell into his illusion. Her mind suffered, and she lost consciousness. Fortunately for everyone, it was found very quickly and delivered to the infirmary. Because of the demon, the mountain of darkness is temporarily closed, and the magic tower explores the district. The maid suddenly reminded that it was the professor of Declane who saved the girl, and this news again brought off the off-balance, why exactly he always comes to the rescue. Then the girl asked what day today. The maid replied that in bed the lady spent 36 hours, so the environment came in the morning. But if today is a medium, then an offshore is completely no time to fly up in bed. Now it should be in a completely different place, and apparently it is terribly late. Having quickly gathered, the girl went to the university core with a bullet to stay at home for all requests and gain strength. She just waved her hand. Out of breath, and barely taking a breath, she entered the educational audience a few minutes before the start of the lesson. She still managed to come on time. She began to wave her hand to Riley, inviting him to sit next to her. The girl said that she had visiting a classmate in the infirmary, but she was unconscious. I noticed an offense that during her absence in the audience everything changed, so something happened, but she still does not understand what was the matter of fact. It seems that today some special lesson was planned again, because Declane entered the audience, but to universal surprise, the professor was not alone. Before the lecture, the man made a small announcement. He presented everyone with a young man named Alan, saying that the guy was recently appointed assistant professor. The hall immediately crawled conversations that Declan had never had associate professors before. Why now the professor took his assistant? If someone becomes an associate professor, then he can start his track record, and therefore, take the first step to the formation of a professor. But why is this the Declan itself? It was for this reason that the father of the offspring, the Duke of the Moon, remained simple and the investigator until he was 30 years old, because he had no opportunity to become an assistant professor. But why the Declan is now brought to the audience of the wizard, whom they had never seen before, especially to appoint him an assistant professor. After a couple of minutes, the professor said that their lecture will be devoted to checking skill. Students must complete their task, fitting in a 3-hour limit. And Offlaw decided to use the souvenir bracelet, which her father left her. Every time she looked at the jewelry, she thought who her father was for Declan. While she was in her thoughts, someone from the back desk shouted that he had completed the task, but only 25 minutes passed since the time they started. Of course, this student, who fully completed her task, turned out to be Sylvia Ilata, even had no doubt about this. It seemed that Professor Declan was also not surprised. He praised Sylvia and said that for today she coped with the task and could be free. Entere thought that she would now explode with anger. She was unpleasant to realize that she was not the first to cope with the task, and now she should hurry. Behind Sylvia, about 10 students also fulfilled their tasks, but the offspring could not get together and start working, concentrating exclusively on the assignment, so 3 hours passed. She wasn't that she could not bypass Sylvia. It so turned out that the offspring remained the only student who could not do anything in the allotted time. Well, who is she after that is really the real fool who is not able to fill the most elementary task. Who is she going to compete with? She even could not finish the academy, but thinks about some place to the Professor Declan. All this time, the professor was staring at the actions of an Exodus. After 5 hours of the movie, asked how much more he would wait for the work of the offspring. The girl thought that he had gone for a long time, but Declan said that it was bad when a student was losing his temper due to such a simple task and could not fulfill it on time. Let even everyone around will mock her. An Exodus should not give up and just go forward with his own way, even if her personal enemy is opposite her. The professor recommended that the girl always stay in a cold mind, because a miserable condition will not help to reach the professor. Before leaving, Declan uttered terrible words. He was disappointed in an offense, and thought that she would try much better. And what could she do, except to prove to this stubborn insolent that not everything is still lost, and she is capable of a lot. Declan also recalled last night he spent more than 6 hours with an off-conference, but it was a necessary investment because an adult impious for him would be necessary. According to the demon that appeared on the Mountain of Darkness, the professor realized that the main plot of the game he developed is about to begin, so you need to be careful and extremely careful. When the era of overwhelming evil comes, a personalized character will need to have a positive effect on the main plot, and one of them will be a matured imprisoned. Now this girl does not have enough mentality and understanding of a real magician, but if an Exodus is able to realize this, then in the future, he will reach incredible heights. Of course, Declan understood all the risks for himself, because the power of the offspring could become a threat to him, but he hoped that he had enough experience to prevent this. Fate is only empty hopes for those who do not seek anything in their lives, but the man is used to seeing the goal and only to believe for himself. Professor Declan will never allow in the future some miserable debutante overtook his skill. But it was not for nothing that he fell into the game. 6 hours later, in 25 minutes, the Exodus finally left the audience. Declan, seeing the girl, realized that she had finally completed her task. The imposition did not say anything, just passed by the professor without even saying goodbye, and the man decided to return to the audience and check the tasks. It was made flawlessly. Amy managed to create a magnificent flower with the help of magic, which could radiate light and warm flame. Naturally, typical mistakes were traced in the work that still needs to be done. But in general, the task was perfectly done. In absolute silence, the man took out the handle from his pocket and put a positive assessment to the girl. The quality of the work she did allows to compete for the first place. The offspring was gone. She decided to finish the conversation, and it was time to return to the professor of Declan to return to her mansion and rest well. But the plans changed sharply, since a man named Zaid appeared in the courtyard of the academy and already walked towards the professor with open arms. Zaid von Bruggen Frieden was the current head of the family Frieden and the elder brother of Julia, the bride of Declan. The professor did not remember exactly what relationship Julia had with her brother. Not Eugene developed this plotline, so everything was confused. But the man remembered exactly that it was Zaid Frieden who actively insisted on the engagement of Declan and Julia, which means he was interested in their marriage. This man was famous for his strength, and since he is here to see a professor, then this is probably because of the stone of the radiance of snow. This means that this situation can also end in the death of the Declane, because the professor cannot contrast this monster with absolutely nothing. Zaid greeted and said that there were rumors in the Empire that a black cat ran between Declane and Julia, and he was somewhat concerned about these news. Further, the professor found out that Zaid was going to organize a joint dinner for them this week. He, of course, does not accept the refusal. Declane noticed that so far a man is behaving quite friendly, but he did not dare to argue, so he listened to which restaurant their joint meeting would take place. What was happening in Zaid's head could only guess, but it is obvious that there were no positive intentions towards the Declane. The professor's soul became more bad. This boor, who pretends to be a good man, did not even leave him a choice, could not refuse to. This meant that for Zaid, the family was in the first place. If the Declane intervenes in his plans, then no one knows how Julia's brother would behave in the future. Julia's brother did not expect that the girl herself would refuse to meet her fiancé in the restaurant. She referred to great employment, and that she and Declan hate each other. This situation seemed ridiculous to a man. Julia was still angry with the professor due to the fact that he bought a stone at the Radiance of Snow at the auction. But the girl was actively trying to prove the opposite. She shouted that she was no longer interested in either the Stone of the Radiance or Professor Declane. Brother began to convince Julia that the professor bought a stone only to make a sword and give it to his bride, that is, to her. But the girl knew for sure that at the same moment when she was presented with a sword, she would immediately declare an entire empire about the break with the Declay of the engagement. The man began to get out of himself these stupid words. He tried to convince the girl that the breakdown of the engagement would be a mere stupidity, and emotions are a poor marriage advisor. As far as Zaid was aware, no one loves Julia as Professor Declane, but maybe the girl had feelings for a completely different person. The brother did not understand at all why Julia was so worried about the weaknesses of the professor, and if this is a problem, then she can be discussed in a restaurant and everything would fall into place. To calm down a little, the girl decided to practice with her teacher. It always distracted her from bad thoughts and returned a good mood. But the teacher was disappointed in training and noticed that all the movements of Milady this time is quite rude and inaccurate, and this was even more angry for the girl. A warrior named Varen was one of the best no-roles. He was a subordinate to Julia and part-time performed the duties of a girl coach. Julia was ashamed of his behavior, but the guy said that he should not apologize because he understands who Milady behaves so irritably. But according to Varen, this man does not even deserve attention. But Julia asked the guy to be silent. Knights should not discuss people behind them. The girl knew that Varen is her confidant and constantly worries if the girl loses their mental balance due to the outputs of Professor Declane. The situation was awkward, so Julia decided to walk a bit in order to calm the raging thoughts and put her condition in order. She already turned around to leave, but Varen called out, asking her to linger for a minute. He said that he had found an answer to his countless shots and doubts. He already knows the path by which he can prove to the young lady his knightly fidelity. He will be able to make Julia truly happy. In the evening, the Council of Elders was supposed to take place in the Magic Tower. It was necessary to discuss subsequent actions because a terrible demon was discovered on the Mountain of Darkness. It was decided to send letters to the 12 of the strongest birth of magicians, since the demon showed up again. Then sitting back is simply impermissible. Each family of magicians had to respond and give their decision to combat demons. It is necessary to do this in the shortest time, otherwise it may be too late. In the mansion of the Declane, real chaos was happening because of the mountain of valuable things that the professor brought from the auction did not manage to make out yet. Since there were too many things, some of them decided to send the Declane to the storage so that they were not stolen. But there was another small problem. And this problem turned out to be the same stone, because of which he almost lost his bride Julia at the auction. Cayman did not want to work. To be honest, Declane did not expect that he could immediately cope with the magical features of the Stone of the Snow. But no matter how he used telekinesis, the stone did not move. Mana, whom the stone owned, was strong and resisted. In the game, this item cost so much that Eugene did not look in his direction. It was necessary to use a distortion. And now, for a day, the professor could not understand how to act further. The phrase from the notebook did not leave his head, that the legendary sword should be tamed. This process is called resonance. But the professor did not understand whether this understanding of the sword itself was. All this was quite confusing from the very beginning. He came to the room 10 times a day where the stone was located. He even tried to talk to him, but all attempts to wake him were unsuccessful. He spent more than 1,000 mana units on this problem, and he received an understanding of the situation by only 100%. He could not cope with such successes in a year. Today he must stop the work because you need to prepare for dinner, which is organized by the brother of Julia Zaid, and especially prepare morally. Declane understood that Zaid never did anything just like that, and it is quite obvious that he was offended by the professor because of his sister, so we can expect anything. The restaurant Von Michel was really the most pathos in the city. Zaid could not choose another place, because he was one of the richest aristocrats of the country. Julia's brother was already waiting at the entrance to the office. He said that his sister had left earlier, so the girl must have been waiting for them inside at the table. And yes, indeed, when men entered the spacious hall, they saw Julia sitting at one of the tables, and honestly, the girl looked just excellent. She was wearing a long dress in heavenly blue in tone to her hair. The neck was decorated with a beautiful necklace inlaid by precious stones, but her face was tense. Eugene nervously squinted at the girl. She always dressed in knightly suits, but now she showed all her femininity, of course, that the Declane fell in love with her. But as it turned out, Julia was not alone. Josephine was sitting next to her and stared at Declana. She said that she had come to just say hello to her future relative. The professor did not expect to see here the older sister of his bride, and he perfectly understood that she had come not only to say hello. Josephine would participate in this stupid matchmaking. The behavior of the sister of Julia was more than defiant. With all her appearance, she showed that a lot would depend on her on this evening. She was not just a relative of Julia. The whole point is that for Professor Declane, this woman was the most dangerous enemy from a number of personalized characters. Josephine was conceived by the developers of the game as a real sociopath, which will stop at anything in order to achieve its personal goals. She was the head of an underground group called Shadow, which runs a continent because of the curtains, and only Zaid could compete with her. And this woman always took care of Julia. Everything was obvious and extremely simple. If the Declane dares to offend Julia, he would find the sister of the most terrible enemy in the face of her sister with great force and even greater influence. Eugene directly with his whole body felt Josephine's piercing gaze. He thought that it was difficult for Professor Declane to make a choice in this story. The man definitely felt the murderous intention of this terrible sociopath, and this meant that the probability of his death was growing rapidly. Now he needs to withstand the pressure of Julia's relatives. But Zaid entered the game and directly asked how much Declane wants to appoint a wedding. Indeed, since the moment of their engagement, the engagement has passed no less, and 3 whole years, of course, that relatives were worried and wanted certainty. The professor was not ready that the conversation would begin so quickly and would be so straightforward, and therefore sat silently for quite some time. But then the Declane looked at the bride and said that it was Julia who should answer, because if she has no desire to get married, then he was just ready to break the engagement. The moment of silence came. Julia was simply broken, and Zaid said that they did not joke with such things, and the Declane speak so frivolously about serious things. According to the brother, young people slightly moved away from each other, and now they need to be more together to be able to resume feelings. And Zaid added that their families are too public, and they cannot just take and dissolve the engagement without a solution to the elders. There should be good reasons. Julia decided to take the situation into her own hands, because now her future was at stake, so she asked to leave her and Declana alone for several minutes. Brother and sister did not really want to leave young people alone. They did not understand at all in what vein the conversation of Julia and Declane would continue. Julia stared at the man. She did not expect anything good, but still decided to ask Declane about what he was up to. Zaid and his sister did not go far. They decided to go to the neighboring hall of the restaurant, and the man and the woman were sure that the young couple would not talk for a long time. According to Josephine, it was clear that she was determined, and what decision her sister would not make, she will have her own personal opinion, and she would act as she believes correctly. When they finally stayed alone, Julia looked into the man's eyes and asked directly what he wanted from her. Declane decided to use a little magical abilities and was able to determine that Josephine was standing outside the door and wants to eavesdrop on their conversation. She cannot leave young people alone. Julia's sister pretended to be with Zaid, but in fact Josephine was standing near the door and was going to eavesdrop on the conversation of his sister. But for the Declane, a good opportunity was also covered in this, because Julia's sister had no idea that now the professor uses magic and knows where she is. Eugene himself understood that according to the plot of the game, Declane sincerely loves Julia. If the girl believes in this, then he could avoid possible death. Therefore, a man, having stood a small pause, told Julia that his feelings for her are pure and sincere, and he is ready to develop their relationship. In addition, they went too far, and now none of them can act freely. He cannot terminate the engagement, as he himself wants. The girl did not believe a single word of the professor. She asked again. Leads this conversation. Most likely the man will further torment her with his tricks. He imposed an engagement, using his ties among aristocrats, even before he met Julia, and then forced them to persuade the girl to agree. Having enveloped her with a total lie, he forced the girl to leave the Imperial Order of the Knights, and she, stupid, believed his every word. Then Professor Declane shamelessly offered Julia the post of commander of the Katakayak Knights of the Euclanes, and when she refused, she began to spread vile rumors about her. Now Eugene looked at the girl and understood how much his hero was a vile type. He really spoiled the life of this poor thing well. For Julia, Declane was evil in the flesh. He confused the concepts of concern and madness with love. He destroyed everything around her so that one had no choice, except to be with him. Because of this, Eugene perfectly understood the girl's hatred of the professor, and somewhere deep down, even very sympathized with Julia and tried to support her. But now, in the image of Declane, he told the girl that he promises not to repeat such mistakes anymore. He knows that he had constrained her all this time, but now he will be different. The man realizes that he acted very disgusting, but not only he, sister and brother Julia, to the same extent limit her actions and desires. He says this in all seriousness, based on observations that relatives do not allow Julia to tear the engagement with him. In addition, in order to become independent, to achieve your dream and become a defender, does Julia need to break out of the tenacious grip of his family? Yes, the Declane is a dishonorable and incorrect type, but it has another side. He honestly tells the girl about what he sees around her, and he does not like this picture at all. Then he went to business, said that Julia was not suitable at all, but he can help her in only one way. They will keep the engagement, but their wedding will never take place. He really wanted to see this girl free and happy, but because of the restrictions of other people's interests, he cannot do this on his own. The girl should also help herself. Declane allowed Julia to use his name to cover as much as she would need to embody his dreams, and he will wait and keep the engagement. In return, he does not ask for absolutely nothing. Just let Julia at least sometimes smile at the meeting. This will be enough for everyone around them to think that everything is fine with them. Julia was in a real shock. She could not immediately answer whether, according to such deficiency, it was too suspicious for the girl. From the words of the man, the girl even blushed, and in this state she was indescribable to charming. This Declane could not help but admit he really liked her. All these words were strange and quite sugary, and she understood with her head that it was completely impossible to believe a man. But besides her head, she had a heart. Therefore, the girl was torn between the two lights. She fought with the mind and feelings at the same time, and frankly, it turned out to be bad for her. 3 days later, finally the same memorable day came. Declane drove into a car, completely immersed in his heavy thoughts. After half an hour, the car stopped near a huge cemetery. The man got out of the car and headed along the wide alley that sank along the graves. The cemetery was simple in nature. It always aroused a sense of sentimentality in the Declane. His heart arrived here earlier than the body, completely dissolving in this place. Finally, he stopped near one of the tombstones. It was here that his memory was. The man bowed his head and thought for a minute. Now he was not a magical professor by Declane, but an ordinary developer of computer games of the huge famous company Kim Eugene. And the girl Ara surfaced in Eugene's memory again. One evening, already closer to the night, Eugene, while still in the office, told his Ari that he was going to put Easter in the game. It will be interesting to players. The boss replied that it would not be superfluous to add a little more the background of Professor Declane. He is a mini-boss of the game, and such a trifle would only benefit. But Eugene objected that such a manipulation would simply be in vain to increase their volume of their work. The guy did not think that this would positively affect sales. Do not put unnecessary additional work on his shoulders. He and so much work. But earlier she lagged behind. She tried to prove to the guy that the developers should put their souls in the game, so players will be able to truly feel the plot. Eugene thought to himself that the girl was carrying some frank nonsense, but he did not argue with the boss, because whoever he was, so that Ara began to take into account his opinion. But having thought a little, the guy agreed that in the words of Ara is still inherent. In the end, it was a hint that the Declane had once lost the bride. Then Ara was enthusiastic about every fun idea that came to the mind, and he could not understand that she found such a funny thing in this. Now it was interesting to Eugene what kind of Easter was left in the game, and what made Ara smile so brightly that evening in the office to return to the memories of Eugene. The professor must find traces. He stood above the tombstone, where the name of Ara von Fergus was engraved in beautiful letters. He thought about her idea of a brilliant, or conversely cruel, wrote his name on this grave. Evgen served as a source of inspiration for Declane. Why then the ground was to use his own name for the deceased bride of Declane, and for which she thanks him, because on the tombstone it was also written, "Thank you for everything." Only one word could fill the man's body with colossal emotions, as if in reality he heard the voice of his boss. The memories of those days flashed before the eyes of an endless wave. He remembered how a girl with a shy smile praised his drawings, how she shared her cloak when Eugene fell under heavy rain. She madly loved to hold Eugene by the hands and speak at that moment that she loved him very much, as she supported and motivated the guy when he wanted to give up. All those 7 beautiful years that they spent together were beautiful and filled mainly by bright moments. He did not spare about any day. This was his memory of the girl. And now Professor Declane fell to his knees in front of the grave and tried to restrain the tears that so unexpectedly approached. The professor was so carried away by his memories and his emotions absorbed him so much that he did not notice at all that they were carefully observed from behind the trees. Constantly, for some time near the grave, the man decided to go back. He calmed down a little and brought his thoughts at least in some order. Well, then his path was blocked. A very familiar face appeared in the middle of the alley, and this face belonged to the killer of magicians Lockhart. Duck Laziness calmly replied that he had recognized the killer. The Tolakart only growled and got even more angry, as the conceited magician dares to say that. Eugene remembered the reason why Lockhart was able to become a natural enemy of magicians. She was the ability of the killer to cancel the magic. In addition, the Loshar attribute did not have any special restrictions. He did not need physical contact. In his presence, it was impossible to apply any magic. The killer of magicians was not intended for long conversations. He immediately rushed into the battle, deciding that in a matter of minutes he would cope with the professor. But apparently Lockhart did not calculate something, because the Declane in some strange way managed to restrain the strength and abilities of this person. But still, the killer of magicians used a very cunning tactical move. He jumped high up and decided to attack the professors from the air. And in this case, he was not able to do anything with the Declay. The man remained calm, but there was not a single injury. The thing was that a few days ago the Declane was able to accumulate 10 units of the store's currency and buy the best qualities of mana for himself, which greatly increased its effectiveness of manipulation. It seems that the professor will again have to get used to managing mana, but he began to invest more strength using the previous amount of mana. In addition, this fact influenced not only Manu herself, as Declane thought, he also had more physical abilities and endurance. Improving the quality of mana led to the fact that a man improved the quality of the whole body, and the professor was very happy about this change. That is why the Declane managed to, without much effort, to defeat the killer of Lockhart magicians in a very meek time, thereby avoiding his death. This case followed that the quality of Mani also affects the fact that the Declane could suppress the force of attributes of other magicians, or even the power of Lockhart. To begin with, he could easily defeat Lockhart using only an iron body skill, but since the peculiarity became stronger, everything turned out much better than he expected. Lockhart was maximally crushed. He considered magicians to be apostates and traitors of God, and his personal enemies, with whom he had fought for a long time. Declane stood above Lockhart and listened carefully to all his statements addressed to him, but for some reason these words did not act on him. He was extremely calm. Lockhart's eyes simply burned with anger because he was not able to defeat this damn magician, for whom he hunted, for whom he walked on the heels, and here again failure. He could not understand where Professor Declane draws his strength from, because before him no one had noticed such a thing behind him. He was a loser magician. The race of Redborn was so named due to the fact that all such children were born shrouded in scarlet haze. It was known that they were descendants of the demons of past eras. They live on the continent, hiding their real origin from others, and are the exact opposite of ordinary magicians. Just like magic was created to fight demons, the conflict between magicians and Red-born was the central element in the creation of a new worldview. And one of the main conflicts in the plot of this game was a conflict between Red-born and magicians. It lasted not only for years, but for centuries, and could not be resolved. Redborn in danger just because of his strange origin, and Lockhart knew about this very well, but could not do anything. Yes, Klein looked at the killer of magicians for several minutes. The idea arose in his head that it is quite possible right now, in a certain corner of the empire, the so-called purification is taking place. He understood Lockhart. He even felt a little sorry for him, because people like him experienced years of oppression and repression, which were a real shame. But Declane believed that if Lockhart continues to kill innocent magicians, then he is the same monster as everyone else. There is simply no difference. It is unbearable to listen to such words from Professor Declane himself, so he asked him to just silently kill him and put him on this point. They both cannot exist in the same territory, because each of them wants to destroy their opponent, but by some strange combination of circumstances, he simply cannot do this. Declane answered the guy that he would not drop to the level to kill anyone, even such a miserable person as Lockhart, because he is part of the great family of the Yuklines. But Lockhart was not satisfied with such a situation. He believed that he was simply trying to build himself as a noble prince before simply depriving him of his life, but it was still useless. The professor replied that in his life there was only the only case when he had to cross through his dignity, and this happened when he met with a demon. The blood of the Yuklines who hunted demons from time immemorial begins to burn, as if during a seizure, when they see real demons. This is an insurmountable instinct. And now it turns out that Professor Declane is not going to sacrifice his dignity and self-control again, just because he saw Lockhart. Declane has long learned how to react to provocations, but simply ignore them, and in this case, he did exactly what Lockhart very angry. The killer of magicians did not expect such a turn of events and was extremely surprised by the behavior of Declane. Now he could not even decide what to do next. Declane really showed himself from a completely different side, demonstrating the mage killer his real dignity of a noble person without any exaggeration. Lockhart never found what to say to the words of the Declane. He continued to lie on the ground, not having the opportunity to climb his feet, and looked at the professor from the bottom up. The professor decided to apply a little more mana to force the mage killer to freeze on the spot and allowing himself to be arrested because there were more than plenty of atrocities. By the will of chance, a police inspector RLP appeared near Professor Declan later. He immediately greeted the man and thanked him for his help in the capture of a dangerous criminal. Lockhart continued to lie on the ground. Once he tried to rise and even threatened and glue, but he simply awarded the killer of magicians with a kick. Then Professor Duck Ladin decided to demonstrate a little skills in front of the inspector and began to use some elements of magic, causing a brightly glowing flame with the help of a hand alone. The policeman was really shocked by what he saw. He could never think that magic could be so impressive and even very beautiful at the same time. Further, the Declane handed the inspector a steel wire, explaining that Lockhart in any case suppresses magic and magic handcuffs in this case will be simply useless. The policeman was surprised that you even took care of the glue about the handcuffs, and he in turn asked how the Inspector Ropa managed to come to Lockhart's capture so quickly. The inspector replied that his outfit had arrived, having received an appeal, and he thought that it was the professor who sent him. But, as it turned out, he did not need help at all, so someone outsiders heard the noise and turned for help. Declane no longer wanted to maintain a conversation with the police. He referred to great employment and said goodbye to the inspector, leaving him alone with Lockhart associated. Separating a little from the scene, Declane thought that this time he managed to settle everything without bloodshed, and he himself caused small victims. Going to the exit from the forest, the man was still thinking that he did not want to harm anyone, even such as Lockhart and his like. The morning of the next day before Klein decided to spend his mansion in the gym, and for this day, for the first time in 15 years, a meeting was convened in the city. Ariel entered the gym. She held a document in her hands and then handed it to her brother so that he could familiarize himself with the information. The document referred to the fact that Brecht convenes a meeting in a magic tower, and the reason for the meeting of magicians are recent events with the advent of demons in their parts. Declane told his sister that he must be present at this meeting, since he is the head of the genus Euclane, but apparently he will need additional security. His enemies do not sleep and look for at least the slightest opportunity to eat, not to kill him, to at least harm him, to disgrace in front of society. The sister perfectly understood that the Declane needed a guard, and very professional, so Ariel offered to call Jeff. He used to work as a mercenary, but in recent years he was a driver and was used to holding behind the wheel, not for weapons, so the professor immediately threw this option. Ariel could not let his brother go to this meeting alone. He simply could not go without security, and she knew very well what she was talking about. Traveling to Brecht is one where survival is not guaranteed absolutely to anyone, including such a famous person as Professor of Magic Declan. The man, in turn, guessed that Ariel was worried about his life solely because he could not give her the reign of the head of the clan dead. While the girl only shook her head and asked to leave the search for the guard on her, she knows in which places you can ask such a person. A real chaos was going on at the post of Order of Freeheim, but if you look closer, there was a training of knights, and Julia watched it. She was the head coach of young knights, and despite her fragility and age, was an excellent teacher, strict but extremely fair. The head of the Order of the Knights went out into the courtyard of the building. He was slightly concerned about the situation that took shape several hours ago. It turned out to be a strange request. Varen, who guarded Julia and therefore was always nearby, asked the boss that it happened that he was in such a depressed state. The man replied that an application had come to the order and she was quite serious, so he was worried and does not know whether to accept such a request or not. Julia's guard replied that he was difficult to worry alone, and this would not give any results, so it is worth sharing his fears with the captain of the knights, Mrs. Julia. It turned out that Julia was asked to become a guard and accompany him to Brecht. More precisely, the application was to be guarded by the entire train, because they knew that if the application was to be guarded only by Declane, the order would immediately refuse. This proposal seemed very tempting to Varen. If they accept this application, they would prove that they could guard a whole train, and the glory about their order would increase several times. And of course, their glorious order will never hurt additional funding, and Julia is not one of those whose personal emotions can affect the quality of her work. Having discussed all the nuances, the men decided that it was necessary to agree to the application, and the head of the order went to Julia to tell the girl the news. Brecht called mountains in the northern part of the continent, 3.5 kilometers high. There were houses of magicians, which were considered elders. In other words, it was the center of magic. Absolutely all decisions regarding the invisible forces were made here, and even the magic tower was always obeyed by the decisions of the elders who had an unthinkable influence. The convocation of the members of the assembly was carried out only by the need. And this happened once every 10, 15 years, and to be called up in Brecht meant that a person enjoys recognition of a representative of the magical world. But at the same time, the call to appear in Brecht meant that the participant could easily get into the category of the cemetery of magicians after a meeting of the elders. At the station, from where the train was supposed to go to Brecht soon, it was calm. There were very few people on the platform. Everyone expected the train to arrive on the platform. Julia was slightly worried because she was engaged in such a task for the first time. She could not let the order, so the girl once again asked if everything was ready for the road. After some time, the silhouette of a high stately man appeared on the platform, and Julia immediately recognized in him her fiancé, Professor of Magic Declan. The man was not alone. He was accompanied by the faithful assistant Alan, who already had the title of associate professor. The guy carried a whole armful of some documents and rushed from the cold. The professor was completely absorbed in his thoughts. He did not utter a word on the way to the station, and it seemed that he was somewhat annoyed. He still did not know who would guard the train. A minute later he saw Julia, who said that from that moment on her order of knights, led by her, would guard the delegation that goes to Brecht. The girl assured the professor that her team would make every effort to ensure that the trip to Brecht would go calmly and would not cause any discomfort in the professor. Julia's expression was very cold, and Declan remembered that a few days ago he asked the girl at least sometimes to make efforts and smile at him. The girl also remembered this, and it generally knocked her out of the rut. Now she thought how to smile at the professor, and whether it would look stupid in such a situation. She smiled, and Declan noticed that despite all the hatred of him, Julia kept steadily and showed herself from the best side, like a real professional. And Declan noticed that a young man was constantly spinning near the girl. He looked like a knight, but something was mysterious in his image. The stranger approached the professor first and greeted himself, then introduced himself to Varen, a personal guard of the young Madame Julia. The head of the order was also here. He confirmed that Varen is a real professional, and next to him and Julia Declan did not threaten any danger. The professor could not fully understand why he did not like this young man. Something was suspicious in his acute gaze and total calm. On the belt at Varen, a sword with an engraving flaunted, which Declan could not remember, and the man decided that just in case he would check it through magic. A minute later, the professor realized that he did not feel any special energy from the guy, and this was even more strained. It seemed to him that a young man could suppress magic. Most of the magicians will be issued, including the professor's car, for which Julia will be responsible for, so all responsibility on her. Declan decided not to go into details why she would guard him. He simply nodded and said that he was ready to be placed in his carriage. Naturally, Alan will be next to him, and Varen himself will closely observe them because he is a personal bodyguard of Julia. And then something strange happened. Julia looked at Declan and smiled sweetly just like that, and this smile was real. Declan had no doubt in this. After a few more minutes, everyone settled in their wagons, and the train set off. It seemed that there was no reason to worry. Everything went according to plan. Laying their things and dealing with landing places, the passengers relaxed a little, spent time in their own way. Someone just looked out the window. Someone read the newspaper. Declan invited Varen to relax for several hours. The guy had to relax, because all this time he was constantly on the alert. The professor himself could not calm down. He had some kind of inner alarm. He first goes to Brecht for a meeting, and the consequences of this trip can be very different. He remembered that with every convocation of the assembly there is some unexpected event. In this case, it can be an attack on the train in which the professor himself moves in. Successful overcoming of this, one of the many possible déclats, requires the most cunning game of minds. In other words, it was necessary to choose a safe train of all, heading to Brecht. If you want to choose a safe option, it was possible to use dark connections and information about which train will be made on. If in the place of Eugene there was a real Professor Declan, then he would certainly have acted in this way. But in the case of Eugene, this cannot be done in any way. And all because Eugene cut off all such connections after the formation of Declan. Now everything will depend only on his skill and ingenuity. That is precisely why Eugene made several preparations to somehow protect himself. Namely, he got the technique of martial arts of the legendary warrior Estron and realized it with understanding. The man remembered how his assistant Alan cried with joy when he found out that the professor was taking him with him in Brecht as an assistant. According to Declan, this guy was a rather ambitious person. Despite the fear of cold and microbes, he did not refuse to travel. A few hours later, the train stopped at one of the stations. Declan did not even pay attention to its name, because it was precisely the end station at the very top of the mountains. Alan calmly slept and probably saw excellent dreams. The professor decided not to disturb him and not wake him up to the very moment of arrival. Now there is only one station left, it will be final, and it will be Brecht, and so far nothing happened to them. Then he chose the right train. So all his preparations were in vain, because before leaving, he used Midas touches on things from the famous master to maximize their protective characteristics. And Professor Declane thought of strengthening the products made of wood steel, which he distributed throughout the train. It seemed to him that it would be safer. He did not even fight and improved the clothes of his assistant Alan, citing the fact that because of the professor himself, his assistant may suffer. He so often used Midas's touch recently that he had almost no mana left. Perhaps it was worth spending her on something else, more useful. For himself, the professor decided that security should be in the first place, but if everything goes smoothly, he would not be upset that he spent so much mana. Declane hoped that the whole subsequent path would be as peaceful as until this moment, but he did not know that strange things had already begun to go into the machine department. Sylvia Elada was not going to part with her favorite books even on the train. She was used to studying on an ongoing basis. Even her father was surprised that so many tasks were set in a magic tower. The girl explained that she missed a lot of classes. Now you need to catch up with everything, and she is going to become an archmage in the future, so she should work more than the rest. Father always supported his daughter, so he only nodded his head satisfactorily. He was proud that Sylvia was very stubborn and always goes to the goal. The girl was not even worried about the offspring, but she realized that she would love to listen to several more lectures by Professor Declane. She asked her father why they went to a meeting in Brecht so early. They could go after a few days and still had time to, which such a rush was for. The man thought for a while, and then recalled that for many years this trip was called the Magician's Cemetery, so they left in advance. At each convocation from Brecht, several magicians lost their lives. The last time 11 magicians died. For a long time, a call from Brecht meant the prestige of the family's family, and if you were chosen as one of 20 participants, then your family will be sealed in history. However, the families of those invited that they were able to take part are forever excluded from the list, and new families come to the vacant place. Now the girl understood what the simplest way to destroy the prestige of the family is, and everything in her thoughts finally fell into place. The path to Brecht is similar to thin ice, where everyone who wants to become prestigious magicians is aimed at the lives of those who have already achieved a special influence in a magical society. So, the father of Sylvia simply took care of their security, having left the capital earlier, and thereby protect them from all kinds of accidents along the road. Father confirmed her thoughts, saying that he received information that a certain group plans to attack trains that would later go to Brecht. He takes a daughter with him, so he realizes the importance of the trip and wants to maintain maximum confidentiality and caution throughout the way, because if they are found, then there are no problems. He decided to explain everything to his daughter, because sooner or later, she will also face the cruelty of this world. She will understand that magicians and wizards are not always honest and kind people. All the deaths that happened to the magicians on the way to Brecht at the meeting can be called natural at first glance, but they are not far away. Meanwhile, the train, in which the Declane was confidently moving along the rails, Alan was still sleeping, and the professor decided to read a little. Suddenly there was a terrible explosion, from which Alan immediately woke up and jumped to his feet. In the car, where they were, a terrible hole formed. From the great power of the blow, the train went off the rail, and for a few seconds climbed into the air, and then collapsed back. But it seemed that the professor was in a completely calm state. He even somehow breathed in relief and closed his eyes. Also the martial arts of the pop. But it helped him and Alan to survive exactly what he studied the initial telekinesis before departure. A group of people in black hoodies and hoods appeared on the roof of the train, of which there was a rope in their hands, and they talked about the professor and magic, obviously about to find Declane. The leader of the gang said that it was unexpected, but they just started, so everyone should concentrate. If they succeed, they will be worthy of rewarded. Further, people in black in turn began to go down on the ropes into the train car through the hole that remained of the explosion. But the Declane did not even move. Not wanting to run away, he called strangers idiots because he had already prepared for their trick long ago. Alan was most scared, who began to shout that they were attacked by mercenaries and tried to take their lives as a professor and all the passengers of the train. With the help of the magical movement of the uspi of the guy so that he does not interfere in screaming by the arm, then he called out Verona and asked him to take the guy to a safe place and evacuated other passengers if possible. For a long time without hesitation, Varen grabbed the professor in his arms and jumped out with him from the car. Alan did not wake up at that time and did not even feel anything. So he remained standing near a gaping hole in the carriage and watched how Varen carries his assistant. The man thought about whether he applied a very large dose of magic in relation to the assistant. If so, then Alan would sleep for several days. But then Dalklin decided to finish things here and then think about the assistant. He turned to strangers and said that their death here will also be considered deaths from natural causes. And now he did not joke at all and was in full reason. He has long been prepared by this moment because he himself developed the plot. At this time, Varen was attributed by the assistant Declane, and in a more or less safe place that was not far in the gorge. There was less wind and there was no snow. Adeline in a few minutes without noise and dust quickly dealt with mercenaries. although it was more tiring than he expected. He simultaneously reduced damage from the explosion on the train and fought with black hoodies. This quite exhausted his reserves of mana. While the Declane was sitting and putting himself in order after the battle, Varen managed to return to him and report that he transferred all passengers to a safe place. Declane looked at Julia's guard, and he did not like something in the gaze of this guy. This look was completely different. But the man referred to the fact that in the eyes of Verona, there was simply some fear and confusion. He himself was taken by surprise with this attack. But then something happened to which the Declane was not ready at all, and red energy began to gather around Varen. It was scary and unpredictable at the same time. Declane dawned as Varen has an attribute of the fate of the villain, and from the very beginning of the trip the guy hid this attribute from everyone, and the professor did not relax too much and did not notice. Suddenly, Varen smiled at an unnatural smile, saying that he was very glad that Dracline survived because he had to kill the professor on his own. Varen once again reminded that there were no passengers on the train, so no one would see how he will deprive the professor of life. Everything is going out for him, as well as possible. In his opinion, the turn of Professor Declane came to say goodbye to his miserable life, and it is Varen that will restore justice. Declane asked for the opportunity to ask only one question. Who ordered Verona to behave in such an inappropriate way? Who is the master of this guy and makes him act so ugly? Is it Julia herself? The guy shouted that he would not forgive the Declane for the pronunciation of the name of his mistress. She is a real knight, and would never have conceived and did not organize this. These are just vile speculations. Professor Declane will die at Varen's hands for the sake of the lady, and her faithful guard will thus save the mistress from mental suffering. The professor began to slowly understand the situation. Judging by the actions and reaction of Varen, Julia had nothing to do with it. Then the man remembered how the head of the order called Verona, before the trip a skilled warrior, who was respected by all the knights. And now he thought if he had mana to battle with this guy. Varen, in turn, began the attack, telling the professor that his duties of the guard and defender of the train are ending right now. He is no longer subordinate to the professor. And like every time, a terrible battle ensued again, where Declane tried to save his life in the game developed by Eugene. At the moment he needed to cancel telekinesis. Meanwhile, Brecht's family representatives had already arrived. Sylvia sat in her room and felt extremely bad, and her soul was restless. Even local ice cream did not help, which was fed by the assistant in part. Time her personal night cereal. All the representatives of the magic were already in place and were located in hotel rooms. Only Professor Declane and a magician named Ravind was not enough, and this girl seemed too strange. The assistant decided to bother me and left his mistress alone and loneliness. The guy understood that his presence is now inappropriate here. Sylvia recalled how a few days ago she decided to go to the cemetery to the grave of her mother Cilia von Ilada. She brought a bouquet of beautiful white lilies to the grave, which the woman loved so much. The girl did not plan to peep at the professor. Just on that day she visited her mother to talk to her. It was an ordinary day, not different from others. She sat near the grave of her mother and told how much a person is a Professor Declane. He seems to believe that a girl simply learns from him. But then Sylvia heard strange sounds and decided to see who else came to the cemetery. It turned out that it was a professor himself, who also stood some grave. The girl saw how the man fell to his knees in front of the tombstone and almost cried. She realized that the man in the grave was very dear to the Declane. Even seeing his hunched back, Sylvia could feel the noble presence of a man. At first glance, it was possible to accurately recognize that there was a decree near the grave. She became interested in who he mourns. It's clear that the professor did not notice Sylvia. She would not allow this. He stood for some time at the grave in complete silence, and then slowly headed for the exit from the cemetery. Her professor, always so cold and extremely strict, now cried, like an ordinary boy, standing at the grave on his knees. This picture caused a great surprise in the girl. It was simply incredible. Sylvia always thought about Declane as an annoying professor who always behaved defiantly. But even he had memories of the past love. His tears in the cemetery at the girl's grave were like falling stars, and Sylvia could not throw this picture out of her head. Suddenly, a father entered the girl's room. The man said that he received information that a certain group plans to attack trains that had gone later to Brecht. Such news surprised and frightened the girl, because in one of the trains there was Professor Declane, and now, remembering his last lecture, Sylvia wanted to experience something. She took out a large stone of mana from her pocket. If now she tries to use this artifact as a conductor, then perhaps she will get what she had planned earlier. Of the 3 attributes of magic, it will need to create a certain energy, using the caster as a source, and the magic of Sylvia, consisting of 3 original elements, really began to activate the stone. Only a few minutes passed. The girl smiled and held out her hand, on which a magic bird of bright yellow color fell. The girl gently hugged the bird and said that from now on she gives her the name Shoestrick. Immediately after that, the bird received her first task, and with a wave of its wings, flew away in the right direction. In simple words, Sylvia created the assistant bird for herself. Then she ordered him to fly to the mountains and see where the train was located with the professor of Declay and whether everything is fine with him. But the professor had frankly not very much. He was lucky, and the train caught on something and did not fall into the abyss. This is exactly what saved the life of a man. He believed that he broke several bones, and although the professor could quickly return to normal, magic, and an iron person, still the man's condition was quite bad. Near him, the energy of Red continued to spin, and Dracline understood that the battle was not completely completed. Varen must have thought out a backup plan. And the professor was not mistaken indeed. To defeat Verona, who was determined to destroy the Declane, was a rather difficult task. Julia's guard still continued to be in health, using protected methods and his magic. He turned out to be a rather strong and skillful enemy. Unfortunately, the Declane, Varen, was much stronger than he expected, so the man tried to make all his abilities and efforts to survive. But even if he was in the most ideal state, it would be a difficult task to defeat this warrior. It was necessary to activate the ability of decisiveness. Even having broken, the magician had to remain decisive and not allow the enemy to break himself. This ability is activated during the fight. One strong and exact blow of Verona's sword, and everything can end. Eugene can again become an ordinary person and wake up in the office at his desktop. At one point in a fierce struggle, the man even thought that he really had come to an end, and he had to prepare to say goodbye to life. The space before the professor's eyes began to blur, and he could not fully concentrate, and Varen continued to attack. At one point, the Declane simply lost his balance and fell to his knee, and his enemy successfully took advantage of this moment and struck a crushing blow. But the Declane was not at a loss, and grabbing a knife from the table, threw it right into Verona, and it so happened that the blow fell right on the guy's hand, cutting it off the body. But unfortunately the man, Varen, continued to stay on his feet and held his sword with his second hand and again wanted to attack the professor. But the car, which almost hung in the air, suddenly swayed, and that was what helped the Declane. His enemy staggered and lost his balance, flying through the hole outside. On the fly, he managed to stretch out the blade and stick it into a stone protruding from the cliff, so he managed to not break straight into the abyss. By Declane, a perfectly chance appeared to take and drop Varen from the cliff. He went to the hole and saw that the guy was just hanging in the air. So the moment of reckoning came. Varen will receive merits, such as he, not a place near the bride of Declane. He just must disappear from her life. But before reset the guy, the professor needed to find out the reason why this guy so aggressively tried to kill him. But the client does not remember that he once crossed his path. It turned out that the guy had previously attacked people to the glue on the prison because of Julia, because he believes that the professor committed many atrocities towards his lady. But this was already interesting to the Declane, who is Julia for this young man, that he is ready for her murder for the sake of her. Varen looked at the professor directly into the eyes and replied that the man would never understand the real reasons why he decided to decide the life of Professor Declane himself. It turned out that Varen had previously attacked people for no reason, believing that they offend Julia. Once he even got to the police station. The police chief thanked Julia when the girl brought Verona to the police and recalled that he was a knight and her sacred duty to protect people. This is what she was doing. Varen was furious. He screamed and demanded to untie his hands. In everything the guy accused the boy and believed that it was that conflict that began. Mother then defended her son Jason and assured that her child is a peaceful and kind boy who could not offend the fly. The woman was very trying to destroy this young man. Perhaps she had reasons for that. But for some reason, Julia became sorry for Verona, who could not resist the aristocrat. She claimed that the guy broke her son and illegally entered her mansion and should bear the harsh punishment for this. She would take care of this. Then Julia could no longer stand it and decided to intervene in the conversation of the woman, Verona, and the police inspector. She asked the woman to calm down a little. The aristocrat claimed that the guy penetrated in an illegal way into its territory, but this behavior is suitable for his social status, so he did this. But Julia is not sure that this skinny and weak guy could climb over a huge and high fence that surrounds the woman's house around the entire perimeter. Then the cheap girl said that he would take the offender herself to the police building. Madame may not bother and calmly go home with her son. When a woman and son left, Varen continued to be indignant, claiming that he did nothing really bad, he only defended himself. The girl replied that the genus Frisia was known on the continent with her strange and slightly aggressive behavior, and she is sure that the guy was telling the truth. But in any case, it is not good to beat people. This is a sign of bad tone. So in the actions of Varen there is also a certain whine, and let not argue with it. She really was sorry for the guy, for whom there was no one to intercede. So Julia invited Verona to follow her. In the order of the knights, she will be able to teach him self-control. This was the first meeting of Julia and Verona. She took him to her order and made it the strongest and most famous for the whole continent by the knight, as well as her assistant. This is how a completely different life of a guy named Varen began. he became a knight of the order and the faithful servant of his mistress, for whom he was ready to give his life without even thinking. However, because of his bad character, he still could not establish relations with the rest of the knights. Absolutely everyone, frankly, did not like him. Julia was the only one in the order who understood him and constantly cared for his physical and mental state. She was the only one to feel his anxiety. While Varen was next to his captain Julia, he felt like a happy person, and most importantly, necessary, because he became the right hand of Mrs. Frieden. She trained Verona so that the guy became the best in the order, and after a while he had already coached other knights himself and continued to practice Julia. The guy simply admired the cheese girl. She was for him the standard of beauty, kindness, and knightly skill. The girl always tried to help those who needed her. Another feature of the young lady was that Julia could not tolerate all kinds of injustice, and each time punished offenders, liar, and various vile personalities. Every day, the admiration and respect for the girl of Varen grew. He no longer imagined his life outside the order and without the presence of nearby Julia Frieden. Declane realized that Varen fell in love with his mistress, but understands that his feelings for the knight, who is his captain, would only harm the girl. Varen could not look at how Professor Declay refers to his mistress, how he forces him to lose emotional balance and sit in a bad mood for hours. And Declane understood that this guy is absolutely right. All the bad things that happen in the game are the consequences of the professor's stupid and rash actions. However, it was at this moment that Varen was mistaken, because now Declane was thinking that this stupid plot in the game should change and correct all the mistakes of a professor of magic. Once again, he looked at the guy who, like a pendulum, dangled in the air, holding only on the handle of the blade, and he became ashamed of his actions. Therefore, he held out his hand to Varen and shouted to grab onto her, because he did not intend to cause any discomfort to Julia or to anyone else. But Varen was in no hurry to trust the Declane. He was still holding exclusively for the blade, fearing that the meanness of the professor had not evaporated and he would not help him. Varen was silent for a while, and then said that he, unlike the Declane, was not going to change his decision. He should still deprive the professor's life. He does not believe a man of a man, because such evil and vile people, like him, will never change under no circumstances. Declane realized that it was simply useless to convince the guy. He already made his stupid choice and pay for him with life, and would not even understand that the most pain of Julia will cause this. Returning to the past, we can say that Julia took care of Verona as her own brother. She felt some discomfort when the guy was not next to her. This even in some ways strained the head of the order himself. He even sometimes made fun of the girl, calling her a real mommy for Varen. And now, falling deep into the abyss, Varen mentally said goodbye to his beloved mistress and hoped that after his death she would be happy. The train car continued to hang almost in the air, and no one noticed how a bright yellow bird appeared in the sky above him. Its feathers were like gold. A bird circled for a long time over the crash site, and it seemed from the side that it seemed to look out and assess the situation from a height of its flight. Being hundreds of kilometers from the train's crash, Sylvia already knew that Declane had deprived Verona's guard and threw him into a deep abyss in the mountains. She understood that it was inevitable. The bird saw everything that she saw, broadcast to the girl. And then Sylvia was called to the meeting, which was supposed to begin soon. Meanwhile, a girl arrived at the scene, Lilia Freeman, who was the deputy head of the security department. From the driver, the girl learned that at first flash pry had occurred, and then strangers appeared in black and attacked passengers, including the professor himself. For Lilia, this was not surprising, because many of the passengers were sent to Brecht for a meeting of magicians, and in this case, misfortunes happen each time, the main thing that did without serious sacrifices. But as it turned out a few minutes later, there are two missing passengers. Professor Declane and assistant to Miss Julia, Knight Varen, went somewhere. Everyone pointed to the sleeping Alan. He lay near the rock, and everyone thought that Perrin lost consciousness during the explosion, but no one understood how he left the train and was in shelter. One of the driver told Lilia that the assassins attacked them. There were a whole group, and probably they blew up the train, putting explosives into one of the stations in it. The man showed a picture that took by accident during the explosion, and Lilia was clear that the train would just fall into the abyss if they had not used magic during the explosion. Lilia guessed about the power of the magic of Professor Declane, but that she was so powerful that she was able to raise the train into the air, she did not know. It was beyond her imagination. All this seemed quite strange to the girl why Varen was dead, and Professor Declay managed to survive, and why Varen had plenty of questions left for Verona. And while she was standing and thinking, she became more and more versions, and then Lilia received a telepathic message and simply froze in place. As always, reporters and ordinary people began to gather to the scene of the incident, who were interested in what happened this time with the train, who was heading to Brecht to the elders. The inspector did not immediately notice that a man was going to their group, and he was going right along the rails, along which the train ran an hour ago. She did not recognize this man. It turned out that Professor Declane himself was approaching them. The man looked directly terrible, Drops of blood remained on his clothes, and absolutely nothing was red in his eyes. The man thought that if not for the strange phenomenon, and if not for the help of the unknown, then at that moment not the knight Veron would lay at the bottom of the gorge, but the Declane himself. Lilia came closer to the professor, introduced herself as an inspector from the security department, and said that she had a number of questions to him, which relate to a recent incident. But it seemed Declane did not react at all to what was happening around him. He did not even look at the girl, but simply quietly, but very clearly asked, which is now an hour. They answered him that the clock showed exactly 3:30, but the man did not even say thanks, but whispered quietly that he had only 6 hours left, but no one understood what he was talking about. Lilia decided to return to her direct duties and continue the interrogation of the professor. She did not know yet, to take him to the category of victims or to the category of suspects. But the man did not listen to her at all, but asked his next question about whether this path to Brecht was the only way, to which the girl replied that there was still a sea path and an ordinary mountain road. While Lilia was writing something in a notebook, the professor simply disappeared. He seemed to melt in the air, and not one of the employees could tell where this strange person went. All this was very interesting. Despite the defense of the train, the battle with the assassins, and then with Varen itself, the professor was able to use high-level magic, which means that he simply had plenty of mana. Elijah squinted her eyes and smiled mysteriously, which means this is the same Professor Declane from the X-Manhwa clan, about which Lockhart told her so much. Meanwhile, in the central hall of magicians in Brecht, a meeting of the Assembly of Elders began. Here everyone was already aware that the train with Declane, which was also heading to Brecht, crashed. There were a lot of people in the hall. They all did that they were discussing the morning event. Each had their own version of what happened. Everyone was looking forward to the appearance of the Declane. Sylvia and her father were already sitting at the table in the hall. The girl was very nervous, constantly looking at the watch. Soon the time will come when the stars gather. The Declane was still not there, and the head of the meeting had already begun his speech. Before they began to work, he expressed gratitude to all those who responded to his call. At that moment, something unimaginable began to happen in the room. The girl felt the mother of incredible power. She was here everywhere, and everyone could notice her. It was the strongest mother. Most likely she belonged to Dissecton, the great elder of Brecht. He was the main candidate for the formation of the Archmage. This man was a legend that left a secular society for his own reasons, which means Sylvia should achieve at least its level in order to compete for the title of Archmage. The chairman said that immediately after clarifying the list of arrivals, they would start a meeting, then the roll call. The first on the list was Hilthion Ilada, the father of Sylvia. The next on the list was Edinson from the Brand family. The girl raised her head higher and then defiantly nodded in the greeting of the other magicians. The roll call lasted about half an hour. The next from the list was called from the Euclid family, but it turned out that the professor of magic still did not arrive at the meeting. The chairman said loudly that if the professor did not arrive before he calls his name 3 times, then everyone would consider that the Declane did not respond to the draft, and, as a result, he will be excluded from 12 sorcerers. Sylvia listened and could not believe her ears. Can they really exclude Declane from the 12 chosen ones? Because the Euclid family was among 12 for 2 centuries. Some of the convocation said that everything had gone to this for a long time, and the exclusion of the Declan is quite expected, because the current professor is not suitable for his ancestors in the wrapper. Relfates began at the table. The convocation in turn whispered that there were too many talk about the Declane and its exaggerated talents. Such words were frankly angry with Sylvia, and on the other hand, they bothered, because members of this convocation could make any decision, and for some reason, they are configured against the professor. The girl counted every second and prayed to all the highest forces so that the Declane would now appear in this hall. His fate depends on this. The chairman very slowly and loudly began to pronounce the name of Professor Declan from the Euclid clan for the 3rd time, and everyone in the hall froze, but did not manage to finish the chairman. At one moment, the door to the meeting room opened, and a man appeared in the opening of a man. Sylvia could give his head on a cut that Professor Declane himself stood there. Indeed, he came closer to the table. Everyone turned his heads, and in amazement stated the fact that the professor was alive, well, and managed to at the meeting. Even being in its not better shape, Declane was still irresistible. Sylvia was sure that now everyone in this hall began to hate him even more. The girl was afraid to admit to herself that this man was her ideal. She would like to at least be a little like him, to know and be able to do the same. It seemed that the Declane did not care that everyone in the hall only waited that the chairman would exclude him from the number of 12 magicians. He was confident in himself and headed for his place at the table. Getting up near his chair, he examined everyone with an impenetrable look and loudly said that the head of the clan Euclane had arrived at a meeting of the elders. So the meeting began. By the way, they invited the head of the Brand family. who expressed its opinion regarding the fact that each school of magicians should issue orders or interact with the church, and magicians should be sent to suspicious regions. But this topic was quickly rolled up. The girl expressed her opinion, but did not receive the support of the rest of the meeting, so they quickly finished with this. The manager of the meeting entered the hall and announced that after 20 minutes a break began in the work of the 12 best magicians, which would last about half an hour. During all this time, Professor DeClane did not utter a word. He sat and watched the present intently. It was clear that the man was very tired. To himself, DeClane thought that he fled here like a crazy man, so as not to be late, and now he listens to any unnecessary nonsense. Besides, he lost a lot of mana. But the man praised himself for the fact that his appearance remained still perfect, even in this state, and he still annoys all those present. During the break, everyone left the hall to breathe fresh air, and then DeClane saw his assistant Alan. He fled to him with tears in his eyes. The guy, for being late, said that he was not allowed to enter the hall because the advice had already begun, and he was very worried about his master. The man looked at Alan from head to toe and decided who could no longer think about him as an innocent child. Something was wrong in his assistant. He did not understand until the end why he did this with this young man, and the most important thing for which he does it, what goal he pursues. Having stood a short pause, Professor DeClane asked Alan not to move away from him a step during the entire meeting, and from now on, it was all constantly nearby. And the professor did this not because of respect for the assistant. He just knew that friends should be kept close, and enemies even closer. This guy needs to look after this guy and find out who he was actually. About half an hour later, the manager announced the beginning of the second part of the meeting. All the magicians again gathered at a huge stone table to resume work. The next paragraph of the meeting was the question of what magicians are going to do with the declared wizard from the red-skinned race. This topic was really quite acute, so the DeClane immediately joined the work. Here they will talk longer and may even quarrel. One of the participants said that the race of red-skinned ones is parasites. They secretly multiply, putting off offspring into society and thereby infecting the lands. But the head of the Brand family, Lady Atensalil, objected. What his evidence is, since he says this, even the magicians have no way to distinguish the red-brown races from others. Someone put forward the opinion that they can invent such an opportunity. There should be a way to identify them, given all the features of the race, and then destroy. Here, Drekline politely asked the man to follow his words, because to destroy the word is incorrect in relation to the red-shaped race. They are not here to kill someone. The man still decided to prove his opinion, explaining that the red-legged people recognize each other and gather together, and without any doubt, they have already had a leader. The young lady again entered into the discussion, appealing that all this information is just rumors, and it is not confirmed by facts. Is it really the very thought that the leader of the red-skinned secretly gathering his relatives, and the magic does not know anything about it, does not cause a sense of disgust from the meeting? But one of the influential heads of families shouted that countless magicians died because of a woman 60 years ago. Then the father of Sylvia asked the word. He wanted to listen to what the professor of magic DeClane thinks about this. The Julin family, to whom the professor belongs, is the family of great exorcists that for many years it has been on sharp spears, destroying demons. According to this word, the DeClane is very important. The man replied that as a person of the present, he is well versed in such situations. The hatred that arises after refusal to think about such topics always leads to misfortunes. However, according to the professor, the persecution of the red-legged ones is wrong, even if he will not be able to stop them, but can delay them as long as possible for the future of the main task. Since the common enemy of this world is red-skinned, and not only he knows about this, but all the magicians present here. The professor replied that in ancient times the race of Red Brow was really an enemy of his family, but if you carefully study the documents, then the fault was a misunderstanding. It was evident that those present did not like the answer of Professor Declan at all. They all wanted to destroy the Rasu Red Courage. 237 years ago, during the Witcher's incident, Rodden was accused, despite his innocence. But because of this incident, the pogroms began. Magicians began to avenge, and many red-legged ones were destroyed at that time. Then they took revenge, and so the cycle of bloodshed began. DeClane confirmed that the incident mentioned by magicians, which happened 60 years ago, is simply a politician. Just a mine with mana stones was discovered on their land. The man's eyes got on his forehead right. He shouted that it was precisely the genus of Euclane that went to the mine, and he was also sure that the pedigree professor had an admixture of demonic energy. The professor reminded the old madman that the main tradition and family of Euclane was the murder of demons, but not the race of red-skinned ones. But the stubborn magician did not lag behind and continued to prove that the red-skinned ones are the same demons that carry only evil to their continent. This was already beginning to angry DeClane, so he asked the man to take responsibility for such words, because it was impossible to declare anyone to be declared demons. He carefully looked at the old grumbler and hinted that the speaker himself could easily become a demon. Thereby the professor showed that the meeting came to a dead end and this topic was postponed until the next day. After the meeting, Sylvia's father said goodbye to his daughter until the next day, because according to the rules of Brecht in one hotel room there could be only one magician. The girl perfectly understood why her father was so worried and afraid to leave her alone in Brest, even for one night. She already saw that it could happen with magicians. Finally, the evening came, and Sylvia was left alone in her room. Before going to bed, she decided to read the rules of behavior in this hotel. There was nothing strange in them. Therefore, the girl with a calm soul lay down in the bed and tried to fall asleep. But in her head there was a lot of thoughts that had to be laid out on the shelves. The girl spent in bed for a long time, but the dream did not come. She even tried to count the lambs, but everything was in vain. Sylvia got out of bed and decided to drink a little water. Maybe this will help her calm down, and she will finally be able to fall asleep to at least relax her body. But returning back to bed, the girl began to notice the strange things that they created in her room. Mother sparkled around, and strange energy was felt in the air. In the next minutes, her hotel room suddenly turned into a corridor. Sylvia was frightened that somewhere she used magic and did something wrong. There was the idea that someone just wants to scare her, and maybe not to scare her, but even take life. The girl picked up the rules again, and read that after the guest lies in the bed, he should not get up until morning, because he could be transferred to another space. It turns out that it was impossible to get up before dawn. That is why this happened to her. She never experienced such a magical phenomenon while she lived in the second sector. It turned out that Mana has the ability to compact as she approached the council hall, but she certainly did not know this information, otherwise she would not have done so. Sylvia was too careless. It seemed to her that there would be no problem if she simply did not leave the limits of her room, but everything turned out to be much more complicated. Now the girl definitely felt the presence of someone else in her room. She could not confuse such feelings with some others. There was definitely someone here. The first thing that came to the girl's mind was to run where they look. That's exactly what she did in a second. The hotel was a one-story building. In the rules, it was clearly said not to rise and not to fall over any emerging stairs. If an open door appears in the way, then under no circumstances you should look into it, and even more so do not go inside. Remain calm. But it was very difficult to maintain calm in this state. Sylvia began to look for the way back, and then she just called to the rescue. The girl rushed from side to side, trying to find the very door that would lead her out of otherworldly reality. Suddenly, one of the doors opened, and the girl froze in place. Professor Declane stood in front of Sylvia. He asked the girl if she was lost, because he heard screams, and decided to check what happened to her. The man opened the door wider and invited the girl to enter his hotel room, and Sylvia, as bewitched, went after Declane. The professor put a student near the fireplace and began to ask what had happened. Sylvia said that she had gotten out of bed and suddenly found herself right in the corridor. The man said that strange magical phenomena always occur in Brecht. Ghosts appear here. Strange sounds are heard. Objects are moving on their own. He reminded the girl that she should have paid more attention to reading the internal rules of the hotel, because all these nuances were registered there. And Sylvia looked at the professor and could not say a word. She simply nodded her head and did not bring a delighted look from a man. Then somewhere near the wall, there were strange sounds, similar to growl. When the girl looked around to see what was happening there, she saw a terrible demon. After a second, Sylvia already realized that the demon was going to attack her and wanted to run, but Declane shouted to her to freeze in place. The man used the function of soaring fragments and killed the demon with a blow, saying that this is just the magic that is intended for murders. Then the man added that initially, all the magic rituals were invented primarily in order to help and not harm. Then he sat down at the desk and picked up the old notebook. Immediately, a flowing flame of bright red color formed near him. Sylvia decided to demonstrate her knowledge from theoretical magic to the professor, and immediately aloud determined what magical skill the professor uses. He nodded his head in consent. Then the girl asked to guess what magic elements she uses. The professor guessed everyone, even never looked towards the girl. She even touched her a little. So Sylvia decided not to try particularly, and took advantage of the simplest magical stunt, a magic circle of air. But here, the professor said that the magic circle of air, which the girl combined with a circle of fire, give an unstable result. You need to try a little more. Then Sylvia decided to ask her teacher what kind of weaknesses he sees in her practice. But the professor replied that the girl should find them on her own. Only by going through all the trials and having tried different techniques of magic on yourself, you can accurately determine your advantages and disadvantages. The man was absolutely sure of this. He asked the girl not to rush too much. She still has everything ahead. She only needs a little more patience and time to improve practical skills. You can't run ahead of the steam locomotive, so Sylvia needs to slow down a little and perceive everything as it is. Everything has its time. Further, the Declane decided to calm the girl a little. saying that nevertheless, her abilities are included in the top 3 best of this world. What else she would wish? To himself, the man thought that this girl is a real treasure. She was born to become an archmage and no one else, because she is the best of the best. The man saw that Sylvia was very tired, because he offered to take her into the room and sit near her until she fell asleep. He did so, sat near the girl and waited for her to calm down and fell asleep, but then he began to feel a strange energy that he did not really like. The man decided to find the source of this energy, which, in his opinion, was somewhere outside the hotel. Declan went into the night garden. Suddenly, he was activated by the skill of wealth, and this very alerted a man. According to the plot of the game outside the convocation of Brecht, you can get to this mountain path only later. He walked along the path, thinking that most likely he would get something more rare than he was waiting for the day earlier. The Declan was not embarrassed by strange different sounds. Other people, having heard this, would have died a long time ago from fear, but not a professor. Around him, there were just various kinds of demons in crowds. They growled, made terrible sounds, but the Declan did not care. He walked confidently to his goal, completely ignoring side effects, in the form of different evil spirits that walked nearby. At one point, he was already tired of the order, and he asked one of the demons if he accidentally saw a little thing here with a high content of mana. The demon did not expect such impudence from the professor. Not finding what to answer the man, he simply disappeared from the field of view of Declan, which was very pleased with the man. Finally, the man in the distance saw a red light, as if a bright flame burned somewhere further, and he went to this fire. Having gone a little more, he finally saw what he was looking for. In front of him was a purified fragment of a magic tree which was split with lightning. This exceeded all the expectations of the Declan. After he got into the game, the man trained a lot, but still found himself in a rather difficult situation. And now, from this element, he can create a magic staff that will definitely help the professor achieve a new, better level of force. The next day, the meeting resumed, but already in a more fierce atmosphere. One of the elders tried to prove that the red-skinned race was demonic. The hot dispute of Declan and Baton found all the members of the council by surprise, and no one dared to be adjusted into their verbal skirmish. Everyone simply watched. The head of the house, Ilad, the father of Sylvia, was constantly observing the Declan. The man knew for sure that the professor was playing a role. In fact, he conceived something. And Sylvia was confident that everyone present, including her father, thinks that the professor protects the red-skinned ones because he had hidden intentions in relation to them. She knew for sure that they were all mistaken about the Declan and attribute to him various kinds of nasty things, which the man never did at all. The chairman already understood that they have never reached the consent in this matter, so he proposed to transfer this issue the next day of the meeting. The elders moved to the following topics that should be discussed, and the meeting of the second day ended on a calm note, and quickly. But Beton hid the anger at the professor. This was visible with the naked gaze. He did not even say goodbye to anyone when he left the hall of the meeting. Declan reminded himself that he did everything for the sake of fulfilling the main quest that awaits him in the near future. In the morning of the next day, the professor decided to unwind a little and walk around the city, especially since he had not been here for a long time, so he went into one of the trading areas. Like the locations where the strongest magicians live, there were several shops in the city where they traded different attributes tied to magic. Declan went into one of them to buy everything necessary to create his magical staff. He will make it before leaving Brecht. Allah decided to accompany his master, but heing somewhere behind, and soon he and the professor were at all lost and walked along the street. The man saw that his assistant was very excited, maybe even frightened. He could not normally formulate his thoughts. It turned out that the boy saw her savior. It was she who took him from the place of the train crash and brought him to Brecht to the professor. The man carefully looked at the girl who entered the store after Alan. He immediately recognized her. It was the inspector of Lilia. The girl nodded her head in greeting and went to the man. She believed that they did not finish the conversation there, at the train, when Declan just disappeared from her. It was stupid to run away this time, so the professor decided to stay kind for some time and invited Inspector Lilly and his assistant to a cup of coffee. It was necessary to somehow thank the girl for the help of Alan, but she ceased to be courteous immediately after she finished her coffee. She had questions for the decree. She asked about the Professor Knight named Varen, what happened to him, and where he went. Declan simply replied that he had died during the attack of the assassins. The waiter brought new dishes, and the girl continued to consider the professors and could not understand that in this man so unusual. A few days before the meeting of elders in Brest, Lilia met at the Public Security Bureau with Lockhart. They sent the mage killer to the worst prison of the continent, but even Lockhart himself understood that he was deserving of such a severe punishment. The conversation took place in the interrogation room, together very unpleasant and frightening, so the guy became less talkative. Changing the tone to a more strict one, Lilia shouted to the guy so that he finally fully activates his abilities. Otherwise, there would be trouble. Lockhart, without thinking for a long time, He decided to demonstrate to the girl what he was actually capable of, and he managed to surprise the inspector with his skills. The girl even envied such skills because, unlike a man, she did not own such magic, so she enthusiastically watched what was happening in the room. But then suddenly Lilia with all her might hit the table with his fist. Her eyes burned with anger. She was afraid that she would not restrain and hit this stupid person. For what reason he creates that which can poorly affect the reputation of their family? 100 times she ordered Lockhart not to chop off her shoulder and be careful. She warned the guy that if someone finds out that he was one of them, who would untie his hands with an oppressor, and she will have to kill Lockhart. But the guy already doubted that someday they would have a chance for a calm life in the Empire. So far they are hiding, but someday it would end. Lilia objected that they were able to hide well, to which Lockhart said that they have demonic abilities by family, both people and the magic of battle precisely because of this. But the girl ordered the guy to shut up because the Red-born are not the only ones who have abilities, and in general, why he climbed to Professor Declane. The department is still watching the family, including the professor, but if there are suspicions, the inspector does not see the reason to leave him alive. Then Lockhart jumped up from the table and said that he would not allow the professor to touch. Declane is a true aristocrat, and there is no reason to kill him. On these words, Lilia even laughed. Lockhart, how many crimes were listed as Professor Declane? He is a real devil. But the guy believed that the great merit of the professor was that he confirmed the fact that red-skinned people are also people. If in this world there were more such aristocrats as Declane, then perhaps red-skinned people could exist calmly next to people. But Lilia laughed again for these words. The girl asked whether Lee Lockhart was in the know that it was the ancestors of Uclane that stood behind a tyranny and the extermination of demons. But the guy was not aware of this. Instead of answering, he asked Lilia thinks how much more time she would be sitting. This question was angry with the girl, but she replied that she would occupy this post until the end of her days, until she proves to everyone that red browsts are an order of magnitude higher than magicians and people. Lilia sat opposite Declane in a restaurant and did not understand what was so unusual in Declane, and what signs make him a true aristocrat. In her opinion, he is a miserable moron. The professor carefully examined the girl and watched her every movement. He noticed that she could not stand the smell of alcohol, then once again asked if she asked him all questions. A few minutes later, Neilm approached their table. His appearance was slightly mysterious and biased. The professor did not like it immediately, so he asked what his opponent was doing here. Neilm smiled ominously and said that he arrived in Brecht to see a professor. He needs to hear something from the Declane, something straight from his dark soul. At the same time, strange things were also happening far from Brecht in the Knights Order of Freud, no calmly at any point in the Empire. The head of the order came to Julia and informed the captain of the Knights that better the representative of their detachment Varen died during the train crash. The girl could not believe in this tragic news as her best knight could lose his life during the task. This simply could not be. Therefore, the girl ordered to immediately prepare for the departure to Brecht. She should hear the whole truth about the death of Varon from the first lips, that is, from the Declane itself. The professor, meanwhile, spent time in the company of Inspector Lilia and Neilma, and frankly the company, it was very annoying him. Neilm for an hour continued to make a hero out of himself in front of the inspector, and Declane was tired of listening to his stupid stories about exploits and battles. Lilia herself tried to understand who this person is for the Declane, and what relations were with them, because judging by the conversation, her enemies are about her. Neilm hinted that during all the meetings, the professor behaved strange enough, and he could not understand the reason why he pays so much attention. Further, the guest suggested that the professor behaves in this way because he wants to protect the red-ruled ones. This is precisely his interest. But then, Yelm recalled that some time ago, it was Professor Declane on every corner that said that all the red-ruled people need to be destroyed because they are the lower race, not worthy to live on Earth. And the guy recalled the professor's article in a scientific journal in which Declane condemned the red-ruled people. Even this Yelm found out from somewhere. Then Yelm drew attention to Alan and called the guy a slave to the professor, suggested that the guy is one of the red-born. Alan wanted to interfere in the conversation and protect his master, stopped the guy, and said that he was unlikely to listen to the words of a person who was thoroughly rotten with envy. In the end, the guest said that he remembers that several months are left before defending the dissertation, and then everyone will find out what deceiver is actually Declane. He will no longer be able to hide his lies for a long time. All this time, Lilia was sitting and silently watched the conflict. She needed to find out whether it was true that Declane really took the side of the red-born. It was quite difficult for her to believe that such a person as a professor of Declan is able to protect the interests of the red-ruled ones. It turns out that everything that Lockhart told her in the interrogation room turned out to be pure truth. Well, then everything will be investigated not in Brecht. The next day, before leaving the City of Magicians, Declane met one of the greatest masters and ordered a staff from him. Side quests were completed, the condition of which was quite fame or bad glory. Declane received several awards and a unique staff in addition. On the train, returning to the Empire, he was forced to share one compartment with a nasty magician Concrete, which patted all nerves in Brecht. The man did not hide his hostility all the way, but fortunately, it never reached the fight. Alan tried to control himself. Declane was returning home with a sense of some relief. This long journey finally came to an end, and one could take on ordinary things. Alan was also insanely happy that he returned to the university and could continue to engage in his favorite science. They have only one transplant left, and if there is no strong snowfall, then by evening they will already safely get to the capital. Well, the word was safe here is inappropriate here. On the platform, a man with an assistant saw Julia. She was out of spirit and headed right to them. The girl greeted dryly, not expressing any emotions. She said that she was aware that they attacked the professor and his team, but glad that everyone was alive and feel good. It was clear that the news of the death of Varen had already reached the Order. Did not know how they distorted the story, but many were unhappy that he managed to escape. Julia said that she read in evening newspapers that Declane and Varen together saved people who survived the train, and now she wants to ask only one thing. She was interested in how her faithful knight Varen was in the last minutes of his life, which he was talking about, and whether he asked Julia to convey anything. Now the professor clearly understood the fact that this girl was close enough with Varen in a spiritual plan. She considered the guy her faithful friend. Declane was going to tell the girl absolutely everything, how vile Varen tried to kill him, how they clashed in a duel, and how it all ended. At least before Julia he wanted to be honest. But now, when he looked into the eyes of the girl, who realized that from all this he could not utter a single word, she does not deserve such a cruel truth. Julia was unshakable in beliefs, but the girl's heart was fragile enough. Her nature was so strange, she recognized her truth. Then she would have lied all the guilt on herself. Therefore, the professor did not want to cause unnecessary pain to a loved one, who Julia considered it that she would be tormented as if a crime subordinate to her own mistake. For the sake of her, he must hide the truth, even if in the future some of the aristocrats and magicians hate Declane for this. Suddenly, a conductor's voice was heard on the platform, who reported that a train was announced to the train that should be in the capital of the Empire. Everyone needs to go into the wagons. A real bustle began on the platform. People were looking for their wagons. Declane and Alan were also supposed to say goodbye to Julia. The girl stood, lowering her head to the floor. She did not want the professor to be able to read her emotions in the expression of her face. She herself did not understand to the end that she was now feeling. Like a real knight, she bowed in front of the professor and politely said goodbye, wished a happy journey. Then Julia turned sharply, leaving the professor and his assistant behind her, and left, never looking back. Yes, the client thought that, apparently, he himself is no better, because he could not figure out these feelings that overwhelm his heart. Alan expressed his opinion that he and the professor are also victims, but none of the people on the platform even remembered this. The surprises did not end there. Heading for his carriage, met with Sylvia, who directly in the forehead asked why the professor restrained the truth. The man decided to pretend to be a fool, and asked what the girl had in mind. Osiah said such words, but she said that he was a magician and understood everything perfectly. Then she took out a book from her backpack in a beautiful green polyth and handed the professor, said that this was her gratitude for the salvation at the hotel. And this girl, just like Julia, simply turned around and ran away, leaving the professor and his assistant to stand lonely in the middle of the platform. He did not know what Sylvia gave him for the book, but he would deal with this already at home, since the trip was terrible. Therefore, the men safely accommodated in the carriage, and after a few hours they were at the entrance to the capital of the Empire. As always, nothing portended. During the first attack, Professor Declane took control of the situation and, together with Mr. Varen, they managed to save the survivors. But during the second attack, the train collapsed down, and apparently, Mr. Varen fell down precisely during the second attack. However, the car for the appearance of the person in which Professor Declane was in surprisingly hung on one of the rocks. As the conductor said, both men did everything possible to take control of the situation, but Mr. Varen collapsed down during the second attack. Julia could not even think that she would be so painful to hear this information. She was insanely sorry for her faithful friend and guard Verona. She asked the train workers. Perhaps there were at least some kind of knight's things to have a memory of this person, but unfortunately, nothing survived. She went straight to the gorge and looked down. In the image of Varen, she lost her reliable right hand and a faithful friend who suddenly left her. In the mansion in Glue on this day, something unimaginable was happening. In the morning, scandals with a sister began, which did not stop in the evening. Ariel accused his half-brother that he again acted stupidly and recklessly, writing out more and more checks in the name of their family. It seemed that Professor Declane again forgot that his financial situation of his family, and so holds on the balance, and then all thanks to the work of Ariel. If he continues at such a pace, then the family would not last even 2 months. Noda could not tell the Noda that his staff was much more expensive, which is why he wrote out a check. But what was the surprise of the sister when the professor said that she would not be worried? He knows exactly where to get the money. Then the man went to the pantry, where all the things purchased at the auction were stored. Ariel naturally followed him. She did not understand how the man was going to act with objects bought at the auction. The woman thought that his brother also acquired them to show off. Yes, the client made a remark to her sister that she should have expressed herself more feminine, because she was already 5 minutes of the family without 5 minutes, and then a woman will be silent at least for a minute. At first, Declan did not understand why the energy of the magnate descends from objects from the auction. He considered them an investment, just as this happens in the real world. However, more recently, a very good thought occurred to him. He finally understood how he could increase his wealth. Being with the help of these objects, you just need to touch Midas. Ariel watched what was happening and did not understand at all how much more her brother would stand like this with an outstretched hand. It seemed to her that the man was crazy. But to her great surprise, he replied that he was going to put these items for auction again. Now he needs a competent appraiser. Ariel protested, "Why sell these treasures so fast? It is customary to store ancient things for as long as possible. Now they can't help out half the price for them." He did not listen. He asked the housekeeper to immediately call the appraiser to the mansion and then help him with the transportation of all these things. The attention of the man was attracted by an old vase. This item radiated positive but very strange energy. It was clear that you were created by the magical talent of a beautiful artisan who put his heart and soul into it. Standing in such a vase will never be wound up. The vase, which was worth a fortune by the standards of the empire, has now turned into an object with which Declan did not want to part. The next morning began in the magic tower of the university, directly in the room, which was occupied by the Club of Simple Magic. There were several people at the table, including Emma. It seemed at first glance that students play cards. And it was really so. The offspring had full house, which the girl was incredibly glad. The rest of the players were surprised and preoccupied with the current situation. The girl wins for the 3rd time in a row, and this slightly strained them. They almost quarreled because everyone wanted victory, as young people played desires. And now I didn't clean the room for a week in the room. All this was like a dream to her. She comes from the Baron family, but she could not even finish the academy since she was admitting to this tower. She received an endless stream of hatred. And the speech here was not only exclusively about the students. It turned out that even a professor did not like it. The girls had to go through real hell and endure many things that were simply beyond the power of others. But who would have thought that an offspring would sit like this in the club with friends and play poker for desires? Friends laughed and had fun, and of course no one noticed how the old professor entered the room and watched from the side of the students for some time. It seemed that a man, seeing students in a game of cards, simply could not stand it and burst with anger that these commoners allowed themselves. Professor Relin and Becca, these two were constantly dug up to people of the lower class, and if possible to humiliate them. This imposition noticed for a long time. Professor Relin shouted that he would do everything possible so that the Club of Studying Magic would be closed as soon as possible, or even eliminated. An Offlaw decided to protect myself and friends, so she explained to the elderly professor that they have all the necessary documents and permits to create a club. The man laughed nervously and asked the guys which of the professors had the mind to approve the creation of such a useless club. And then, having better looked at the offspring, the professor remembered that this is the same student who recently was at a disciplinary council. This impudent professor simply ran into rudeness. He again allowed himself to call him a commoner, and this was already crossing the line. But the girl did not look away, but drilled the professor with her own eyes, which simply knocked out the man from the rut, and he was even at a loss for a while. He shouted, so that the girl does not dare to look into his eyes and turned away, but she did not even move. The elderly man had no choice but to leave, muttering under his breath that he doubts that one of the professors here really approved the decision of the commoners. But the very moment entered the cabinet to Klein, he watched the conflict and confirmed that he was the professor who allowed the club to create. It is done to these students their permission, and if Professor Relina has any objections, then he can immediately voice them. He approved the creation of the club and considers his decision to be absolutely correct. Besides, the guys here are engaged in cases useful for the academy. The old professor wanted to object to something, but in a second he changed his mind and did not tell what the students really did here. The guys saw that the Declan was not in the best mood, so they just decided to apologize for the noise and return to their jobs. For actually, he was a little inflated. At first his sister got him with her questions and tantrums, and now at work, students create unnecessary problems. And this old man professor, from whom sweat pours in 3 streams, generally removed the man out of balance and forced him to be even more angry. Professor Relin decided on the go to change the situation in his direction, so he smiled broadly and said that for the club, this place is too big. He just thought that magic from the magic tower of the Imperial Academy deserved the best equipment and better furniture. The old man said that he would take on all responsibility and expenses, and in the near future he would replace everything better and better. Declane only smiled and said that Professor Relin is very kind to these students, and he thanks him for such gestures of goodwill. To himself, the man thought that worthless cockroaches would always behave as appropriate to insects, and this old man would not change. Allow the situation to poor students now. The Declane has stepped up and gathered to the exit from the magic tower. He soon began a lecture. Many time has passed since the last practical lesson of Professor Declane, and all students were waiting for a magician. Sylvia also sat in the audience and waited for the start of classes. The girl read about the incident with a train in a newspaper for magicians. While everyone was noisy, Professor Declane entered the lecture hall. The man was in a raised mood, asked for silence, and began a lecture. The first theme of their current lesson concerned pure elements and magical interference. These concepts were rather complicated. Magic interference was cases in which the spell of one magician was broken through the intervention of another. Before they moved to the fundamental part of the lecture, the professor suggested starting with an exercise for a warm-up, and his assistant with a box in his hands entered the hall. There were mana stones that immediately scattered along the audience by radiating a beautiful blue color around him. The professor explained that these magic stones cost 3,000 coins apart, so students should treat them more carefully. He will leave these stones hang in the air precisely in this position, and young people will try to pick them up by interference in his telekinesis. And then there was the main phrase that in off-confront, if the students succeed, then they will be able to leave stones for themselves. Declane recalled that for a novice spell, interference blocking is as important as the use of the magical spell itself, which is certainly advanced in this situation, but students should try. Then he took one of the stones, and with the help of his hands, began to direct him to one of the corners of the lecture audience, and the stone obeyed the professor. Students were simply delighted that now was happening in the lecture audience. Absolute silence reigned in the room. Everyone was busy with work. The professor thought to himself that the last time he stopped and raised the train into the air, but he only recently remembered the basic telekinesis. He needs to use techniques with telekinesis more and get used to its presence in his mind. And he would also like to see how long his telekinesis can hold out, resisting 150 magicians. Also during this lesson, he will conduct an experiment for himself and see how he can cope with children who own the highest level talents. These damn magic resources were horrible. Sponsorships of the offshore almost ended, and the magic stones were very useful. Sylvia perceived this occupation differently, and in particular the task. She was bored, because she would have coped with such a task very easily. Some students did not succeed at all. It was due to the fact that they wanted to control their actions too much. Alan watched the process with admiration and understood that at that moment, the professor controls 150 stones overnight, and students could not cope with them. Declane himself saw that not one of his students can at the moment carry out interference, but each of them was held to the last, spending all his forces. Then the man's gaze settled at Sylvia, which easily controlled and held the magic stone near him, preventing him from slipping away. The Empress, on the contrary, used most of her forces and concentrated her attention not on the stone, but on how other students cope. Sylvia was the first to cope with the task. The professor went to the girl and praised her for excellent work. In principle, he expected that this time everything would turn out perfectly, because he realized how strong the magic would take possession of this girl. As a result, she turned out to be the only one who fulfilled all the instructions of the professor. None of the other students managed to finish the work. The man had mixed double feelings. On the one hand, he understood that he was enough. On the other hand, he was disappointed with weak students. Sylvia also carefully watched the work of her classmates and also disappointed every time someone failed the task. Half an hour later in the audience, there was a voice of an X-Manhwa, which informed the professor that she also managed to cope with the task. After another half an hour, the professor could not stand it. He felt sorry for the students, so he shouted to stop. He decided that both him and the students need to take a break. Everyone tried and spent an incredible amount of resources. Everyone in the hall sighed with relief. They began to remove the mess, which was left behind during the task. The classmate of the offspring could not understand how she was able to fulfill this overwhelming task. She directly envied the girl. But the imposal of the depositly laid her head on the desk and replied that she herself did not understand how she did it. Probably just an accident. Sylvia from afar observed the behavior of an offense. She did not understand how the girl managed to take the second place and complete such a difficult task. So the strange rumors that Professor Declane left work late due to classes with an exodus turned out to be pure truth. It turns out the professor lied to her. He pays more attention to this compassionate of the offspring. Well, what he found in this fool. When everyone rested a little and came to their senses, the Declane proposed to continue the lecture further because they still had material for study and several tasks. In the previously proposed practical task, all students made a lot of efforts to carry out a magical interference, but there is an easier way to confront telekinesis. Now he looked at two girls who managed to cope with the task. Perhaps they both already understood what the man was talking about. The professor, speaking of a new method, had in mind the interference of mana to teach to use this method of his students. The interference of mana, in contrast to the common methods that consist of blocking the noted magic, this method implies an understanding of the spell of another person and his interruption. However, the reason that this method is universal is that it has a lot of restrictions. The interference of mana will work only if a person has knowledge of a sufficient number of different magic circles. Practice shows that for protection, it is best to use barriers or other spells that are directed directly to the counterattack. The cap of technology is to find the central chain of a magic circle. In other words, students need to understand what central chain their opponent uses and intervene in it. If students master this technique of mana, then it will become much easier for them to conduct a magical interference, and now he will teach those present to distinguish between the central chains of magic circles. First, you need to consider a magic circle for a spell called a Storm Spear Blade, which destroys the type of magic will always have a central chain. Professor DeClane did not even notice that he had given a lecture for 2 hours, and none of the students during this time left his audience. Everyone was extremely interesting. He thanked the students because they spent a lot of time and effort. They will be able to disassemble the rest of the material on their own, thinking about the material and realizing it. At the end of the lesson, the man said that the students are waiting for an intermediate certification, so let them be convinced that they learned all the previous topics well. The friend of the offspring was already completely tired, was indignant that the professor did not disassemble the material to the end, but left him for independent study. But this was not worried to EMU. Today in the lesson she felt as if insight had descended on her. It was difficult to describe in words. From her thoughts, she was pulled by the voice of Sylvia, who turned to the girl and called her a commoner once again. A friend stood up for EMU and said in response that they would not allow aristocrats to treat them in a similar tone. And the last time they lowered everything to the very way, but then it will not continue. Next time they will simply take and beat a rich boor. Another student from high society came up to the girls and asked him what she had done so that she would climb the second place from the very last group. I was so happy with my achievement that I didn't even listen to a stupid guy. Still, his little brain could not correctly understand her words. But the subsequent phrases of the guy were much more offensive. He asked if an individual could bribe the professor because she did not belong to a famous family. The girl could not help but react to such a statement. She turned to Ham and asked to repeat it. Just said. And he repeated, while saying that everyone knew that physical assembly goes to personal classes with the professor of Dekle. She is a real fool who even could not finish the academy, as she now managed to get a magical power so suddenly to stand on a par with Sylvia. The guy began to mock, say that the Declane simply regrets her and gave the girl a mana stone as a gift, which she would then change with money. And since she does not have a house or parents at this stage of life, who, if not a professor, regret such unfortunate people. The level of anger at the offline beat over the edge. She barely restrained herself so as not to break his nose to this rich idiot, so she asked him to just leave. But it turned out that this boor was not from a timid dozen, and he continued to provoke a girl to an even more stringent conflict. A friend of an Exodus, watching all this process, just begged the girl to calm down and recover, but did not listen at all. Then a friend put forward an iron argument to which an offspring reacted. What would happen if she is punished again for such behavior? The classmate once again reminded the girl that real magicians in any circumstances should always remain calm, so the offspring should just spit on this arrogant fool. It happened. The conflict was exhausted, and the guy stood and did not understand how he should behave further because he was simply ignored. The offspring immediately got up when she saw a dumbfounded boor. The girl immediately offered her friend, "Go to the cafe and buy something tasty." Already on the street, I realized that she restrained herself only thanks to Julie's friend, but if she had not been, then the situation could be quite deplorable. The girl promised herself that she would definitely take revenge on the nobleman, and this promise was overheard Sylvia, which stood around the corner. The young aristocrat came out from behind the column and directly scared the off-confront, who did not expect to see classmates here. There was a small but very awkward pause, after which Sylvia asked the girl for several minutes to talk with her. An offspring had no idea what this conversation would be about, but it was ugly to refuse an aristocrat, besides her opponent. But nevertheless, for persuasiveness, I warned Sylvia that if she decided to provoke her and run into a fight, she would quickly suit her without provocations. Sylvia decided not to pull the rubber and directly asked if an offspring with the professor of Dekle additionally, but she asks for an honest answer. This was the last straw in the patience of an Exenai. They all generally understand that these words even sound as stupid as possible. What kind of classes can be discussed? Sylvia also learned that an Exodus with a professor had a terrible relationship, and they have not digested each other, and she would never have asked him about additional classes. I was already ready to start a fight, and she already did not care what consequences it could have in the future. Everything has already taken it. But Sylvia's words made her freeze on the spot. The girl said that after the death of her father, the professor had never appeared in the laboratory. A minute later, the offshoot laughed, of course. DeClane did not visit the laboratory. Because all the inventions belonged to her father, he had nothing to do there. But then Sylvia reported that the professor began to come to the laboratory every day and was doing this for the last 3 months, not missing a day. And he tidied up there, took out a bunch of garbage, hired an assistant, and bought many different magical tools for work and research. The girl was not ready to hear such information why they declined to resume developments again. Without her father, he could not cope. Before Sylvia, she did not want to voice her thoughts about this, so she replied that she did not care what the professor was doing there. She was not interested in this. The girl frowned and simply said that she wanted to know about this, an offense not from outsiders. But since she was not interested in such information, she no longer dares to detain her. I spent a particular state for several days. The news that the DeClane resumed research did not crawl out of her head to the very next lecture at the university. For some reason, they were gathered for some reason again in the lecture hall, without telling the very purpose of such a meeting. Probably a crazy professor again conceived something. Nearby, the girls turned out to be Byrne, who last time tried to humiliate an imposition in every way, but this time they ignored his stupid attacks. The students did not have to wait long. Professor DeClane entered the audience and greeted the present loudly. He began the lesson. The man said that today they will have the last practical lesson before intermediate certification, so everyone should be extremely careful. Today's lesson is unusual. It will be nothing more than public practice, because future magicians constantly work with a mass of people. Therefore now they must all together go to the square near the central core of the university. It is there that they will complete the task. The off-field and her friend were delighted with such news. There really were a lot of people on the square. The girls were even a little confused. The professor said that it was before this crowd of people that they will all participate in a magical competition, using their personal methods of struggle. They should fight each other, practicing the magical techniques that they have learned, but during this, it is necessary to demonstrate 3 forms of magic of pure elements. And the professor does not matter at all whether they will lose or win. His main task is to evaluate the battle itself and the methods used. Observing every student, DeClane was going to record their main strong and weaknesses, and in the end, he would voice the result. Professor Rellin will also be present and carefully monitor that no one gets physical injuries during the fight, and students suggest that they immediately start. The first to go to the center was a student named Yuro-san. DeClane invited the guy to choose an enemy from among those present. The guy, without thinking twice, took his opponents of a student who was not distinguished by special successes, and DeClane concluded that the success of the Eurozan in the future could not be seen. Not all magical fights were smooth on this day. The teachers carefully monitored safety precautions and performance technique. At first, the students behaved somewhat inexperienced because they did this for the first time. Someone was embarrassed by the public. Someone was not confident in their abilities and knowledge. But in the end, the professor concluded that each of them has a positive dynamics. Sylvia was especially distinguished, which defeated all the fights. Byrne chuckled with commoners who, for the most part, showed average results. The guy believed that they certainly had no place among aristocrats' magicians. But he did not take into account that an imposition had not yet participated in the competition. The girl calmly waited for her turn and tried to concentrate exclusively on her thoughts. Sometimes she screamed the words of support to her friends who were in the ring, thereby showing rich idiots, which is most important to have human qualities. The next to the ring, Professor DeClane called this abnormal Ham Byrne and invited him to choose a worthy enemy on his own. And what was the surprise of the offspring when Byrne shouted loudly and self-confidently that he was choosing a commoner and a loser of an offshore from the Luna clan in his rivals. The girl calmly went into the ring and thought that maybe it was for the better, so she would have the opportunity to legalize this insignificance for all humiliations. Byrne sarcastically asked the girl if she had nothing against the fight with him, because she was trained in secret from everyone, so she had nothing to fear. Watering the mud of others was the absolute norm for Byrne, so the offspring was very hoped to teach this arrogant aristocrat a real and cruel lesson. To begin with, she agreed to the battle, while saying that all the attempts of the guy to copy the style of Professor DeClane look just shameful if you look from the side. She calmly and slowly went to the center of the arena. Now the girl was going to prove to Byrne in public that his magic was ordinary garbage. The guy did not expect such impudence from the side of the commoner in his address, so he did not wait, and the statement rushed into battle to take all his evil on the girl. Byrne shouted that after a few minutes he would provide an offshirt with her parents in another dimension, and began to attack using his techniques. But how strong was his disappointment when the guy finally realized that his methods were too weak against the power of magic which was used by the offspring. The girl was completely concentrated in a duel. She did not let out a single enemy gesture, inflicting more and more beats. The impudent recalled one good saying that a good thrashing is good especially for the nobility, and now it has the opportunity to demonstrate this in practice. Her friend watched her friend intently and rejoiced at every successful impact of the girl. Finally, at least someone was able to teach this arrogant idiot. A few minutes of the real shame of the aristocrat burned past, and finally he fell to the ground, asking for mercy from his competitor. He understood that he had failed with a crack. The girl's face finally broke into a real smile. She was happy, and then asked Byrne how he feels in the role of a humiliated and defeated commoner. But Professor DeClane had his own opinion on this score. He believed that this couple could not even arrange a spectacle for invited guests, because the duel ended too quickly. DeClane looked at Byrne, who tearfully begged him to give him another chance to recoup because he could not leave here with such a shameful result. The offspring was justified. She could not use 3 types of magic only because she came across too weak the enemy, so the battle was so short. And the man agreed with the offspring. Not her fault that she did not manage to demonstrate all her skills, so the exam is not considered complete. The DeClane thought a little, and then invited the girl to choose a new opponent from among the remaining to show herself to be fully. And off time, without thinking for a long time, pointed to Professor Declan himself and loudly said that she would like to fight with her teacher. She did not agree to other options. The old Professor Rollin even laughed. He did not expect such impudence from this girl, although he admitted that she fought really very cool. A real booth began around. Everyone was noisy and waited for Professor DeClane, whether he would fight his student in front of the whole public. The imposition of such an effect expected, because the girl was far from a fool. She waited a very long time for this very moment. This is a real chance to avenge her father. The old professor began to blame the girl and call her an upstart, but DeClane asked the old man to calm down and engulf. He makes a decision here. The man calmly went to the middle of the ring and answered in execution that he was accepting her offer. Let him begin to prepare for a duel. He himself said that an off-door could choose anyone without specifying anything else, so he is ready to fight and will not even attack her first, giving her some advantage. And the DeClane added that without problems, he would count the victory of the girl if she forces him to move to a centimeter throughout the battle. The offspring simply nodded. She couldn't even talk normally from excitement. Her heart jumped out of her chest and her knees trembling treacherously. How many hundred times she imagined this duel. How many times she dreamed of victory over the professor, and now that significant moment came. Antoinette perfectly understood that she could not oppose anything to her opponent because their forces were simply unequal, but there was no way back. Now maybe she will not be able to win, but so she will be able to at least reduce the gap of forces between her and the professor, because he was huge. The girl attacked the first, and for this blow she accumulated all her energy. The professor was even somewhat surprised by such a zeal and the efforts of the student. And she entered the courage and felt that she could attract even more magical energy for the next blow. It turns out that everything is not so bad for her. Professor Rollin and a friend of the diplôme observed everything that was happening, holding their breath. At that moment, it was not clear who would be the winner in this battle. But about half an hour passed, and I realized that it would be difficult for her to win this battle. The DeClane stood in place as if dug and did not even move. The girl decided to change the strategy a little and try the use of a hail of magic shells. This should work. The professor read her intentions and began to add more interference in his magical power, which slightly restrained the power of an offense. In the end, the DeClane was tired, and he simply decided to break the magic chain that the girl used. As a result of the deprivation fell right in the middle of the arena. He carefully looked at the losing student. In his soul he regretted that he had done this to her, but she could not use her magic against him anymore. The girl tried to rise and rush to the professor again, but her forces were too weak. She could not stand a single attack anymore. Everyone who watched this spectacle was in some confusion. No one knew how to react to the loss of students, and whether it was worth congratulating the DeClane. Only Burns stood and grinned quite. He knew that the offspring would be praised, because she showed incomparable results, but still, the girl as a result fell and gave up. Indeed, immediately after the professor left the arena, classmates ran up to the offspring and tried to help her rise. Everyone wanted to express their admiration to her. At this time, somewhere in the sea, a pirate ship slowly swam near the coast of the empire, on the board of which Ganesha stood and peered into the horizon. Another ship was visible there. An hour later, 2 vessels approached each other. Several people jumped onto the deck to Ganesh and began to cheerfully welcome the adventurous girl. Together with them was a sweet girl Vane named Yuri. She was a favorite game character in Ara, the former girl Eugenia.